Hey guys, tonight we are going on a little trip. Not to a pristine castle or a sun-drenched ancient ruin, but somewhere grittier. We are heading back to the heart of the 19th century, to the sprawling, steaming, chaotic metropolis of Industrial Revolution London. And we are not here to discuss politics or inventions. We are here for dinner. Though I have to warn you, you will probably want to skip it. This journey is about discovering why the food in this era was not just bad, but legendarily, dangerously awful. You might not make it through the first day with your stomach intact. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. It truly helps the channel find other history lovers like you. And while you are at it, drop me a comment and let me know what city you are listening from, and what time it is for you. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let us ease into tonight's journey together. You do not arrive in a flash of light or with a dramatic thud. It is more like fading in. One moment, you are in your quiet room. The next, you are standing in mud. It is a thick, greasy, black mud that seems to suck at the soles of your shoes. The first thing that hits you is not a sight, but a smell. No, not a smell. An assault on your senses. It is a thick, physical presence in the air. A cocktail of acrid coal smoke, damp wool, unwashed bodies, horse manure, and something else. Something uniquely foul rising from the nearby river. Welcome to London, circa 1850. This is your first appetizer, and it is free of charge. You are standing on a crowded street, a narrow canyon between soot-stained brick buildings that lean into each other like tired old men. The sky, or what you can see of it, is a permanent shade of bruised gray, hazed over by the relentless smoke pouring from 1,000 chimneys. The noise is a constant, churning roar, the clatter of iron-rimmed carriage wheels on cobblestones, the cries of street vendors hawking their wares, the distant, rhythmic clang of industry, and the murmur of 1,000,000 people crammed into a space that can barely hold them. You try to get your bearings, but your nose is still processing the dominant, underlying scent. It is the River Thames. You had imagined it as a majestic waterway, but from here, it smells like an open sewer. And that is because, well, it is. This is a well-documented piece of London's history. For centuries, the Thames was the city's primary drainage ditch. All the waste from homes, from factories, from slaughterhouses, ended up here. By the mid-19th century, it had become a slow-moving soup of filth, especially in the summer. This period would culminate in an event historians lovingly call the Great Stink of 1858, when a heat wave baked the river into such a toxic, pungent sludge that Parliament had to soak its curtains in chloride of lime just to conduct business. But you are not in Parliament. You are on the street, and you are starting to notice the more specific aromas. As a man leading a cart piled high with animal hides pushes past, you catch a whiff of the tanneries. This leads to a rather buzz or little fact of London life. The Pure Finders. These were some of the poorest people in the city, often elderly women or children, who made a meager living by collecting dog droppings, known as pure, from the streets. This was sold to tanneries, where it was mixed with water to form a solution used to break down the fleshy fibers on the hides before the tanning process. So, as you carefully step around the muck on the street, just know that some of it was actually a valuable commodity, contributing its own unique note to the city's olfactory symphony. You feel a sense of overwhelming smallness, Everyone around you is moving with a purpose you do not share. Women in bonnets and shawls hurry by with baskets, their faces smudged with soot. Men in flat caps and worn-out coats shoulder their way through the throng. A group of children, barefoot despite the cold mud, chase each other down an alleyway. Their laughter sharp and brief. You notice their faces are pale, their frames thin. They look like they have not had a decent meal in a week. And as that thought crosses your mind, your own stomach crumbles. It is a low, insistent growl that cuts through the external noise. You are hungry. The reality of your situation begins to sink in. This is not a museum exhibit you can observe from behind a velvet rope. You are in it. You are breathing it. And soon, you will have to eat it. The smells you are experiencing are not just an atmospheric detail. They are a warning. They are the airborne evidence of the bacteria, the pollution, and the decay that seeps into everything here, especially the food and water. Historians still debate how much the average Londoner of this era was habituated to these smells. Did they become nose-blind to the constant stench, simply accepting it as the normal scent of life? Or was it a daily, conscious source of misery and anxiety, a constant reminder of the unhealthiness of their environment? For you, the newcomer, the answer is clear. It is oppressive. It feels like a physical weight on your chest. And it makes the idea of putting anything in your mouth a terrifying prospect. That your hunger is growing, a gnawing emptiness that demands to be filled. You need to find something to eat. And that, you realize, is where the real adventure is about to begin. That gnawing emptiness in your stomach is becoming a roar. It is a primal, urgent signal that momentarily eclipses the smell of the coal smoke and the chaos of the street. You need to eat, and you need to eat now. Your eyes, now a little more adjusted to the gloom, begin to scan your surroundings with a new purpose. You are no longer just an observer. You are a hunter, foraging in a jungle of brick and soot. The options seem plentiful. At first glance, the cacophony of the street is punctuated by the specific calls of food vendors. A man with a tray suspended by a strap around his neck bellows, "Pies, hot pies." His voice is rough, competing with the rumble of a nearby omnibus. Further down, you see a woman standing over a small, smoking brazier. A crowd of children gathered around her. What she is selling is not immediately clear, but it smells vaguely of roasted chestnuts. Near an alley, a man shucks oysters with a deft flick of his wrist, laying them out on a board, a bottle of vinegar at the ready. It all sounds almost charming, like a scene from a Dickens novel. But as you take a few steps closer for a better look, the charming veneer begins to crack. The pie man's tray is grimy, and his wares have a uniform, pale crust with a sheen of grease that could be anything from butter to reclaimed lard. The oysters, a staple food for the London poor and not the luxury item they are today, are sitting in the open air. They look gray and tired. You glance down at the cobblestones around his stall, littered with discarded shells and a suspicious-looking puddle, and you decide to give the oysters a wide berth. This is the first lesson you learn about eating in 19th century London. Finding food is easy, but finding safe food is a different challenge entirely. The city's population had exploded, far outstripping its ability to feed itself cleanly and honestly. A vast, unregulated market sprang up to fill the gap. There were no food safety inspectors, no nutritional labels, no sell-by dates. The relationship between buyer and seller was one of fleeting, anonymous transaction. A vendor could sell you a stomachique in a pastry crust and be gone by the time the first cramps set in, swallowed up by the city's endless labyrinth of streets. You continue walking, your hunger now wrestling with a growing sense of dread. You pass a stall selling a London specialty, hot eels. Eels were one of the few things that could thrive in the polluted Thames, making them an incredibly cheap source of protein. A man with a ladle scoops chopped eel pieces from a large, steaming pot into a small bowl for a waiting customer. The customer then drenches it in a vinegary sauce from a communal bottle. The whole thing has a slightly gelatinous, wobbly appearance. You watch as the customer, a laborer on his lunch break, slurps it down with gusto. This introduces a fascinating and still debated question among historians. How much did the average person actually know about the dangers in their food? Were they blissfully ignorant, trusting that what was sold was fit to eat? Or did they possess a kind of grim, street-level wisdom, a cynical understanding that all food was a gamble and you just had to play the odds? Some scholars argue for the former, pointing to the lack of scientific knowledge about germs. Others believe that Londoners were savvy consumers in their own way, relying on word of mouth, trusting certain vendors over others, and knowing that a bit of indigestion was simply the price of a cheap meal. For you, though, the risk seems too great. The eels are a hard pass. You are looking for something basic, something fundamental, a staple, and then you see it. A little further down the street, a baker's shop. It is not grand, just a small, dark storefront with a window displaying a few loaves of bread. Compared to the open-air chaos of the street vendors, the bakery feels like a bastion of stability. The smell of baking, faint, but definitely there, cuts through the city-esque tension, speaks to you on a deep, comforting level. Bread, it is the staff of life. Simple, honest, life-sustaining bread. Surely, you cannot go wrong with bread. Your decision is made. It feels like the safest, most logical choice. You feel a small wave of relief wash over you. You have navigated the first treacherous waters of the London food scene and made a sensible choice. You just want a piece of bread to quell the rebellion in your stomach. Something to tide you over until you can figure this world out. You pull the door open, a small bell jangling overhead, and step from the dim street into the even dimmer interior of the shop. The baker, a large man with flour-dusted eyebrows and a weary expression, looks up from behind the counter. The loaves on display are impressively, almost brilliantly, white. They look clean and pure, especially in contrast to the filth outside. This whiteness was a major selling point in an age of grime and soot. Whiteness equaled purity and quality. It was a sign of finely sifted flour, a luxury that distinguished it from the coarse, brown bread of the rural poor. You point to one of the smaller loaves. The baker nods, takes your coin, and drops the loaf in a piece of newspaper. The transaction is simple. Quick, you have your prize. Holding the surprisingly hefty loaf, you step back out onto the street. You have done it. You have bought your first meal. You find a relatively clean-looking doorstep to sit on. Eager for that first, comforting bite, you tear off a piece. The texture is a little off. It is denser than you expected, slightly dampened clay-like, but you are too hungry to care. You lift the piece to your mouth, ready to finally eat. You take a bite. The immediate sensation is one of disappointment. It does not have the rich, yeasty flavor you were anticipating. Instead, it is bland, with a strange, almost mineral-like aftertaste. The texture is even more concerning now that it is in your mouth. It is heavy, pasty, and it feels like it is coating your tongue in a fine, gritty film. You chew thoughtfully, trying to place the taste. It is like a mouthful of damp chalk. You look down at the loaf in your hands. That brilliant, reassuring whiteness now seems artificial, almost sinister, and you would be right to be suspicious. You have just had your first taste of one of the most common and insidious forms of food adulteration in Victorian London, alum whitened bread. This is the big, mainstream historical fact of the matter. Bread was the absolute cornerstone of the working class diet, often making up more than half of a family's daily caloric intake. Because of this, the bread trade was fiercely competitive. Bakers were under immense pressure to produce the whitest, heaviest loaves for the lowest possible price. The whiteness was key. Consumers of the time associated it with purity and quality, a sign that the baker had used expensive, finely milled flour to achieve this look without the cost. Many bakers turned to chemical shortcuts. The most common of these was alum, or potassium aluminum sulfate. A small amount of alum added to the dough would bleach inferior or spoiled flour, making it look like the highest grade. It also allowed the dough to absorb more water, which made the resulting loaves heavier. Since bread was often sold by weight, the heavier loaf meant more profit. It was a perfect scam, a win-win for the dishonest baker. That for you, the consumer, it is a definite loss. Alum is an astringent, which is why your mouth feels so strangely dry and puckered. It is also a powerful irritant to the digestive system, and chronic consumption was linked to all sorts of gastrointestinal issues, from constipation to severe stomach pain. You are essentially eating a chemical salt that was also used in leather tanning and dyeing fabrics. You take another look at the loaf. The weight that felt so reassuring in the shop now just feels like a dense brick of deception in your hands. This practice was so widespread that it became an open secret. Social reformers and early food scientists were railing against it for decades. In his pioneering 1820 work, A Treatise on Adulterations of Food and Culinary Poisons, the German chemist Frederick Accum specifically called out the fraudulent and unwholesome practice of using alum in bread, warning that the baker is the most fearful of all sophisticators. Yet, here you are, 30 years later, and the practice is clearly still going strong. As you sit there on the grimy doorstep, contemplating the chalky bread, you might notice something else. If you were to crumble a piece, you might see that it does not break apart like normal bread. It has a strange cohesiveness, a sort of clammy quality. That is because alum is not the only uninvited guest in your loaf. To further bulk up the weight and stretch the flour, some bakers would add anything they could get their hands on. The most common additive was chalk, which contributed to that brilliant whiteness and the gritty texture you are now all too familiar with. But that was just the beginning. Here is where we get into the more obscure, and frankly disgusting, little details. Records from the period show investigators finding plaster of Paris, bone ash, and even sawdust mixed into the dough. Plaster of Paris, or gypsum, is essentially powdered rock. Bone ash, just as the name implies, was made from crushed and burned animal bones. These were not just harmless fillers. They were indigestible materials that could cause serious internal blockages and wreak havoc on an already poorly nourished population. The historical debate here is not about whether this happened. It absolutely did. The question historians grapple with is one of intent and scale. Was every baker a villainous poisoner, knowingly stuffing his bread with plaster? Or were any of them caught in an economic trap, forced to use these tricks to stay in business against competitors who were doing the same? Was it a system of mass deception, or a series of small, desperate acts of economic survival? Some accounts paint the bakers as cynical profiteers, while others show them as victims of a brutal, unregulated market, where the price of flour fluctuated wildly on customer demand for impossibly white, cheap bread was relentless. The truth, as is often the case, probably lies somewhere in the murky middle. You put the piece of bread down, your hunger is gone, replaced by a queasy feeling of betrayal. The one thing you thought you could trust, the simplest of foods, has turned out to be a carefully constructed lie. It looks like food. It was sold as food, but it is more of a chemical concoction designed to imitate food. You crumble a bit more between your fingers, feeling the fine, unnatural grit. You have just learned a vital lesson. In this city, even the staff of life is leaning on a crooked handle. The problem was not just that food was scarce or expensive for the poor. It was that the food they could afford was actively working against them. A Trojan horse of chemicals and filler brought right into their homes. You look at the remaining loaf, wrapped in its newspaper shroud. It suddenly seems less like a meal and more like evidence of a crime. The disappointing, gritty bread has left a bad taste in your mouth, both literally and figuratively. You toss the remainder of the loaf into the gutter, where it lands with a dense thud. A passing stray dog sniffs it, then seems to think better of it and trots away. When a London street dog turns its nose up at food, you know you have made a bad purchase. Your stomach still feels hollow, but now it is also churning with a mild, chemical unease from the alum. What you want now, more than anything, is something to drink. Something to wash away the chacky residue and settle your nerves. Your mind immediately goes to milk. It seems like the perfect antidote. It is nourishing, calming, and wholesome. It is the very picture of pastoral innocence. Surely, milk is just milk. It comes from a cow. What could possibly go wrong with milk? You get up from the doorstep and resume your cautious exploration, this time looking for a dairy or a milk cellar. It does not take long. In a slightly wider street, you see a woman with a yoke across her shoulders, 2 large metal pails hanging from each end. She is a milkmaid, but not the rosy-cheeked, bucolic figure you might imagine from a nursery rhyme. This woman is gaunt, her face etched with fatigue. She moves with a slow, trudging gait, calling out in a tired voice, "Milko." Any milk below? A few women emerge from the doorways of tenement buildings, holding out jugs and pans. You approach her, holding out your own small coin. She stops, ladles a measure of thin, bluish-white liquid from her pail into a cup you are now carrying, and takes your money without a word before moving on. The transaction is as swift and impersonal as the one with the baker. You stand there, holding your cup of milk. It looks watery, very watery, and the color isn't unappealing, pale blue. But you are thirsty, and the idea of clean, cool liquid is too tempting to resist. You take a sip. It is thin, almost tasteless, with just a faint, jacky sweetness. It has none of the creamy richness of fresh milk. You have just become another victim of Victorian London. This is another one of those huge, well-documented historical problems. The journey of milk from a cow in the countryside to a cup in the city was long and fraught with opportunities for fraud. Fresh milk was a valuable commodity, and there was every incentive to make it go further. The most common practice was simple dilution. Milk was routinely watered down, often by as much as 25 to 50%. And the water they used was not coming from a clean, filtered tap. The water source was often the nearest public pump, which itself was frequently contaminated with seepage from nearby cesspits and the general filth of the city. The infamous Broad Street pump, which Jon Snow would later identify as the source of a deadly cholera outbreak in 1854, was a prime example of how lethal public water could be. So, when you are drinking your watered-down milk, you are also getting a nice dose of whatever bacteria was festering in the local water supply. But the fraud did not stop at water. After diluting the milk, the seller would be left with a thin, bluish liquid that did not look very appetizing. To restore its creamy white appearance, they had to add things. Just like with the bread, chalk was a common additive, used to whiten the liquid and give it a bit more body. This accounts for the faint, sweet chalkiness you are tasting. Sugar was also sometimes added to mimic the natural sweetness of fresh milk. Now, here is the really bizarre and slightly horrifying small fact. For truly deluxe adulteration, to give the milk a thicker, more convincing texture, some of the most unscrupulous dairymen would add pulp sheep's or cow's brains. The fatty, emulsified brain matter would suspend in the liquid, giving it a passable imitation of the creaminess that had been lost through dilution. It is a grotesque thought, but a documented one. Investigators of the time found all sorts of horrors lurking in the city's milk supply, while brains were probably on the more extreme end of the scale. The addition of chalk in contaminated water was nearly universal. Historians are still debating the full public health impact of this. How many infant deaths, in an era of terrifyingly high infant mortality, could be attributed directly to this contaminated, nutritionally void milk? It is a difficult question to answer with certainty. The records are often incomplete, and people at the time did not understand germ theory. A baby's death might be attributed to fever or wasting, when the root cause was the chronic, low-level poisoning from its daily milk. It is a grim calculation, but scholars argue that adulterated milk was a major, if silent, contributor to the city's tragic child mortality rates. And what about the cows themselves? London still had its own urban dairies, where cows were kept in cramped, filthy, and oft unwindowless sheds in the back alleys and mews of the city. These shed cows were often sick, fed on distillery waste and brewers' grains, and lived in appalling conditions that were a breeding ground for disease, particularly bovine tuberculosis. This could then be passed on to humans through the milk. So, even if you were lucky enough to get milk that was not watered down, it might have come from a diseased animal living in a slum. You lowered the cup from your lips, the milky liquid suddenly feeling vile in your stomach. It was meant to be a comfort, a source of nutrition. Instead, it is a cocktail of dirty water, chalk, and potential disease. You have now had two of the most basic staples of life, bread and milk, and both have been deceptive and potentially harmful. The feeling of being cheated is now mixed with a genuine sense of vulnerability. In this world, the very act of trying to nourish yourself is a high-stakes gamble. You pour the rest of the milk into the same gutter where your bread now lies. Two of the city's most fundamental foods. Rejected. The hunger is still there, the low hum beneath your growing anxiety. But what can you possibly try next? Your quest for sustenance has so far been a spectacular failure. The bread was a brick of chalk, the milk a watery, contaminated lie. You are feeling queasy, hungry, and increasingly disillusioned. The idea of a formal shop, like the bakery, now seems just as risky as an informal cellar. Deception, it appears, can happen anywhere. So, you find yourself drawn back to the chaotic, vibrant energy of the street vendors. At least with them, there is a certain transparency. You can see the food being cooked, or at least, assembled, right in front of you. Your gaze is drawn to a man doing a brisk trade from a small, noble cart. He is selling what appear to be meat pies. They are small, individual-sized, and he pulls them from a tin hot box that sits atop a charcoal brazier. The faint glow of the embers visible through a grate. The smell is enticing. A savory, meaty aroma that, for the first time today, actually smells like real food. People are queuing up. A couple of dock workers, a young woman with a baby, a clerk in a slightly too shiny suit. They hand over their pennies and walk away, biting into the pies with an air of simple satisfaction. Maybe this is the answer. It is hot, which might have killed some of the germs. It is popular, which could be a sign of quality. And your stomach, ignoring the warnings from your brain, is crying out for something substantial. You decide to take the plunge. You join the short queue. And soon enough, you are handing over a coin and receiving a small, warm pie in a square of greasy paper. It is warm in your hands, a comforting weight. You step aside, find a sliver of space against a wall, and take a tentative bite. The crust is flaky, surprisingly so, and the filling. It is hot, savory, and heavily seasoned with pepper and herbs. It is actually quite tasty. You cannot immediately identify the meat. It is minced too finely, but it has a generic, savory flavor. For a moment, you feel a wave of pure relief. Finally, something edible, something that tastes like it is supposed to. You take another, bigger bite. This, you think, is the classic London street food experience. And it is. You are eating what was known colloquially as a penny pie. This was the quintessential fast food of the era, the 19th century equivalent of a slice of pizza or a hot dog. It was cheap, portable, and filling. But as you continue to chew, you might start to wonder, as generations of Londoners did, what, exactly, is in this pie? The heavily seasoned taste, while pleasant, also serves a very practical purpose. It is excellent at masking the flavor of the primary ingredients. This is where the gamble of street food truly lies. The pie man's profit margin depended entirely on sourcing the cheapest possible meat. And in a city like London, cheap meat was a category with a very, very broad definition. The mainstream historical knowledge is that these pies were often made from trimmings and offcuts, bits of gristle, fat, and organ meat that the butcher could not sell for a higher price. This, while not exactly appetizing, was not necessarily dangerous. However, the penny dreadfullest, the cheap, sensationalist newspapers of the day, were full of much more lurid tales. Urban legends abounded about pies filled with stray cats, dogs, and even rats. The most famous of these stories is, of course, Sweeney Todd, the demon barber of Fleet Street, whose victims ended up in Mrs. Lovett's famously popular meat pies. While the story is fiction, it resonated with the public precisely because it played on a very real, very deep-seated anxiety about the mysterious contents of processed meat. So, what is the weird niche fact here? While cats and dogs were probably more legend than reality, one documented ingredient in the cheapest of pies was something called lights. This was the Victorian term for animal lungs. Lungs are spongy and do not have much flavor, but when minced and cooked down, they could provide bulk and a vaguely meaty texture to a pie filling, all for a fraction of the cost of actual muscle meat. So you could very well be eating a lung pie. Another common filler was offal, like tripe or heart, all minced beyond recognition. The academic debate on this topic revolves around the prevalence of the truly rotten meat. Some historians argue that while the ingredients were low grade, Vendors had a vested interest in not making their customers seriously ill, as their business depended on repeat customers. They suggest that the use of truly spoiled, diseased meat was likely rare, an act of desperation by the most marginal sellers. Other historians, citing reports from reformers and city missionaries, argue that the use of carrion meat from animals that had died of disease rather than being properly slaughtered was alarmingly common, especially in the poorest neighborhoods. The truth is, you, the customer, would never know. You were placing your trust in a complete stranger, whose entire business model was based on ambiguity. You take one last bite of the pie and decide that is enough. It satisfied your hunger, but now your imagination is running wild. The savory taste that was so welcome a moment ago now seems to hold 100 sinister possibilities. Was that a bit of gristle? Or something else? Is the peppery kick meant to enhance the flavor, or to disguise the taste of decay? The experience of eating a penny pie perfectly encapsulates the Londoner's daily food gamble. It was a transaction based on calculated risk. You paid your penny, you got your hot food, and you hoped for the best. Sometimes you won. You got a cheap, tasty meal that got you through the day. Sometimes you lost. You spent the night with stomach cramps. Or worse, for hundreds of thousands of people, this was not an occasional treat. It was their daily reality. You have had a taste of that reality, and it has left you feeling full, but far from satisfied. The city has fed you, but it has offered you no comfort and no certainty. Having navigated the treacherous world of savory street food, your palate, and perhaps your sense of morbid curiosity, turns towards something sweet. After the chalky bread, the watery milk, and the mystery meat pie, you crave a simple, uncomplicated pleasure, a bit of sugar, a treat. Your eyes scan the bustling street and land on a splash of brilliant, impossible color in the sea of gray and brown. It is a confectioner's stall, or what passes for one on the street. A woman presides over a tray of sweets, arranged in neat little rows. They are dazzling. There are vibrant green lozenges, fiery red drops, and sunny yellow twists of boiled sugar. In this world of soot and grime, these colors are magnetic. They look like tiny, edible jewels. They seem to promise a moment of pure, joyful sweetness, a small escape from the grim reality of your surroundings. Children are clustered around the stall, their eyes wide, pointing with grubby fingers. An adult worker, his face smudged with coal dust, buys a small paper cone of the green sweets, popping one into his mouth with a look of brief respite. It seems so innocent. You decide you deserve a small reward for surviving this far. You approach the stall, point to the most vibrantly green candies, and purchase a few for a half-penny. They feel hard and smooth in your hand. The color is an intense, almost luminous green, the kind you would see in a child's paint box. You pop one into your mouth. The flavor is intensely sweet, with a faint, minty, and slightly metallic tang. It is not unpleasant, just strange. As the candy dissolves on your tongue, you feel like you are getting a pure, unadulterated hit of sugar. And for a moment, it is wonderful that you, the modern time traveler, should be feeling a sense of alarm. You have just put poison in your mouth. This is the core historical truth about Victorian confectionery. Its beauty was often deadly. In an era before food coloring regulations, confectioners used a variety of potent and often highly toxic chemicals to achieve those brilliant, eye-catching hues that so effectively attracted customers. Your lovely green sweet gets its vibrant color from a chemical called copper arsenite. also known as Sheila's green. It was a pigment originally developed for use in paints, wallpapers, and dyes, and it was notoriously toxic. It contained arsenic. Yes, that arsenic. The classic, tasteless poison of choice in countless mystery novels. The metallic tang you are tasting is the copper. The arsenic, unfortunately, you cannot taste at all. Consuming it, even in small doses, could lead to a whole host of horrifying symptoms, from stomach cramps and vomiting to skin lesions and, with enough exposure, a slow and painful death. And the other colors on the tray were just as dangerous. That fiery red, it was likely achieved using red lead, a lead oxide that is a potent neurotoxin. The sunny yellow, probably lead chromate, another lead-based compound. White sweets were sometimes bulked up with plaster of Paris, just like the bread. The confectioner's tray was not a delightful assortment of treats. It was a periodic table of heavy metals and toxins, beautifully packaged to appeal to the very people, children, who were most vulnerable to their effects. This leads to a particularly sad and bizarre little historical fact. The case of the Bradford sweets. In 1858, in the English city of Bradford, a confectioner was making a batch of peppermint humbugs. He sent his assistant to the pharmacy to buy what he thought was daff, a harmless plaster of Paris substitute he used to bulk out his sweets. However, due to a mix-up at the pharmacy, the assistant was accidentally given 12 pounds of arsenic triazcate instead. The confectioner, oblivious, mixed the arsenic into his candy batch and sold over 40 pounds of the poisoned sweets at the local market. The result was a mass poisoning. Over 200 people fell seriously ill, and more than 20 died, most of them children. The tragedy became a national scandal, one of the key events that finally spurred public outrage and pushed the government towards regulating what went into food. The academic debate surrounding this issue is not about the existence of these poisons. That is well documented. The controversy lies in the culpability of the confectioners themselves. Were they malicious villains, knowingly poisoning children for profit? The consensus is, for the most part, no. Most street-level confectioners were likely ignorant of the true danger. They bought their coloring agents from druggists or color men, who sold them as simple pigments. The confectioner knew that a pinch of emerald green would make his sweets sell, but he likely had no idea that he was handling a compound containing arsenic. He was just another link in a long, unregulated supply chain of toxicity. Is ignorance an excuse? Ethically, perhaps not, but historically, it paints a picture not of individual evil, but of a systemic failure to protect the public. A world where science had created potent new chemicals, but society had not yet created the rules to control them. You quickly spit the half-dissolved candy out of your mouth. The sweet taste is now tainted with the metallic hint of poison and the chilling knowledge of what it contains. You can still feel the chemical residue on your tongue. The beautiful colors of the sweets on the stall now look like warning labels. They are the bright, garish colors of a poison dart frog, a clear signal of danger that the people of this time were unable to read. Your simple quest for a sweet treat has led you to one of the most direct and frightening examples of the dangers lurking in the city's food. It is not about long-term health effects anymore. This is immediate, acute danger, sold for a half-penny and disguised as a child's delight. Your stomach turns again, this time with a mixture of fear and disgust. You need a drink more than ever, but after the milk incident, you are terrified of the options. Still, you need to wash this taste out of your mouth. Maybe a cup of tea. That is a classic English comfort. Surely, a simple cup of tea would be safe. The metallic, poisonous ghost of the green candy lingers on your tongue, and you are desperate to wash it away. Your mind lands on the most English of beverages, the ultimate comfort in a cup. Tea. It seems like a safe bet. It is just dried leaves and hot water, and a nation obsessed with it. Surely the tea supply would be sacred. You imagine a cozy cup, warming your hands, the gentle, earthy aroma, the calming your frayed nerves. You spot what you are looking for. A small grocer's shop, its window displaying canisters with faded labels. One of them clearly says TEA. This feels more promising than a street stall. A proper shop. You go inside. The air is thick with the competing smells of dried goods. Soap and sawdust on the floor. A man behind the counter gives you a non-committal nod. You ask for a small amount of the cheapest tea. Just enough for a cup or two. He scoops a dark, dusty-looking pile of leaves from a large bin onto a piece of paper, weighs it, and folds it into a neat packet. You find a place that sells hot water. Many poor families did not have their own means to boil it and would buy it by the kettleful and prepare your brew. As the hot water hits the leaves, it releases a weak, faintly earthy smell, but it lacks the rich, fragrant aroma of good tea. The resulting liquid is a pale, sad-looking brown. You take a sip. It is weak, astringent, and has a slightly bitter, almost dusty taste. There is no complexity, no comfort. It is just colored hot water. You have just been introduced to the thriving and highly deceptive world of recycled tea. Tea was a huge deal in 19th century Britain, a national obsession that cut across class lines. This massive demand created an equally massive market for counterfeiters. The mainstream historical fact is that a significant portion of the tea sold to the working classes was, to put it bluntly, garbage. Your packet of dusty leaves has likely been on a very long journey. The scam often started in the grand houses of the wealthy, or in hotels and tea rooms, after the upper classes had enjoyed their high-quality tea. They used wet tea leaves were not thrown away. Instead, they were a valuable commodity. Servants would collect them and sell them to agents who specialized in recovering them. These men would buy up heaps of soggy, used leaves and take them to clandestine workshops. Here, the leaves would be spread out on trays and air-dried, often over fires that coated them in soot. Once dry, they were dull and lifeless. To bring back the appearance of fresh tea, they needed to be faced or blowed. This is where the truly weird and specific adulteration comes in, to restore the blackish, glossy look of good black tea. The counterfeiters would add black lead, also known as graphite. They would literally toss the dried leaves with the graphite powder, which would coat them and give them a convincing dark sheen. If they were trying to imitate green tea, they might use the same toxic copper-based pigments you encountered in the sweets, or a mixture of chemicals like Prussian blue and turmeric. But it did not even stop there. To add bulk and weight, these remanufactured tea leaves would be mixed with other, cheaper botanical matter. The leaves of the sloe or elder bush were common additions, as were hawthorn leaves, in some of the most egregious cases documented by food reformers. Investigators found everything from sawdustins and to iron filings and sheep's dung mixed into the tea, all held together with a bit of gum. So the packet of tea you just bought might be a cocktail of second-hand leaves, graphite dust, and random foliage from a hedgerow. The lack of flavor, the dusty aftertaste. It all makes sense now. The historical debate on this topic centers on the consumer's awareness. Did people know they were buying this rubbish? Many historians believe that, for the poorest customers, it was a case of you get what you pay for. They knew that the tea sold for a few pence an ounce could not possibly be the real thing, but it was all they could afford. A cup of wheat, graphite dusted. Second-hand tea was better than nothing. It provided a hot, slightly stimulating drink that offered a moment's pause in a brutal day. They were complicit, in a way, in their own deception, because the alternative was no tea at all. Other scholars argue that many consumers were genuinely duped, especially as the counterfeiters became more skilled. The art and mystery of tea adulteration, as one contemporary critic called it, was a sophisticated business. They were masters of mimicry, creating a product that looked, at least to the untrained eye, in a dimly lit shop, like the genuine article. The fraud was so rampant that it became one of the first and most high-profile targets of the early food safety movement. Arthur Hill Hassel, a pioneering physician and investigator whose work we will touch on later, made his name by using microscopy to show the British public exactly what was in their daily cuppa. His detailed drawings of teal he's mixed with iron filings and Prussian blue, published in the medical journal The Lancet, or a sensation and a scandal. You stare into your pale, murky cup. Another simple comfort, another basic staple of life, has been revealed as a sham. The bread, the milk, the sweets, and now the tea. They are all part of a system that seems designed to extract the maximum profit from the most vulnerable people, with a complete disregard for their health or well-being. The pattern is becoming clear. If it was cheap, and it was sold to the poor, it was almost certainly not what it claimed to be. You pour the sad excuse for tea into the gutter, next to the remains of the bread and milk. Your little patch of street is becoming a graveyard of culinary disappointments. Your stomach is still empty, and your spirit is starting to feel the same way. You are starting to feel a bit desperate. Everything you have tried to eat or drink has been a failure, a chemical concoction, or a recycled fraud. But the hunger is a persistent, physical ache. You need protein, real, solid protein. Your misadventure with the penny pie has made you wary of minced, unit and fightable meats. But perhaps the answer is something more straightforward. A sausage. You can see a butcher shop down the street. It looks more substantial than the pie cart. There are actual carcasses of pigs and sheep hanging on hooks in the open front. A slightly grim but also reassuringly authentic sight. This is where meat comes from. No mystery there. In the window, coiled on a tray, are long ropes of plump-looking sausages. They are called bags of mystery for a reason. You know that. But surely a proper butcher, with his reputation on the line, would use better ingredients than a transient street vendor. You step into the shop. The smell is thick and cloying. Fresh blood, sawdust, and raw meat. The butcher, a large man with a blood-stained apron, is busy chopping away at a block with a cleaver. You ask for just one sausage, pointing to the ones in the window. He grunts, spears one with a hook, wraps it in paper, and takes your coin. It feels heavy and dense in your hand. Now you just need to get it cooked. Many pubs or cook shops would cook a piece of meat for a customer for a tiny fee, using their large fires. You find such a place, and soon your sausage is sizzling over a grill, releasing a fatty, savory smell. Finally, it is done. It is browned on the outside, sizzling with fat. You take it, let it cool for a moment, then take a bite. The texture is soft, very soft, and the flavor is predominantly of bread and pepper. There is a meaty taste, yes, but it is in the background. The overwhelming sensation is of a spiced, fatty, bread-based paste packed into a casing. Welcome to the world of the Victorian sausage. Much like the pie, The central question plaguing every consumer was, what exactly is in it? The well-known historical reality is that sausages were the ultimate repository for everything that could not be sold as a recognizable cut of meat. But it goes far beyond simple trimmings. The primary ingredient, which explains the soft, pasty texture, was bread. Stale, leftover bread was bought up for pennies from bakers, soaked in water, and then mashed into a pulp. This formed the bulk of the sausage filling, sometimes accounting for more than 50% of the weight. To the spready base, the butcher would add the absolute cheapest meat scraps available. This could be gristle, skin, and organ meats, but it also frequently included meat that was past its prime. Meat that was starting to turn, to smell a little off, could have its decay masked by the heavy-handed use of seasonings, particularly pepper and sage. The fat content was also incredibly high, as fat was cheap and added both flavor and weight. Now for the obscure, slightly stomach-turning tidbit. The problem was not just the meat that went into the sausages, but also the state of the workshops where they were made. Investigations from the period describe sausage-making facilities in horrifying detail. They were often located in filthy, unlit cellars, with meat scraps stored in rotting tubs. The mincing machines were rarely cleaned. One of the most shocking and recurring findings by health inspectors was the presence of horse meat. Old, worn-out horses from the city's carriages and carts were often sold for pennies to back alley slaughterhouses, and their tough, dark meat was ground down and hidden in the bready, spicy mix of the common sausage. Selling horse meat for human consumption was illegal and considered a major taboo, but it was a rampant and profitable black market trade. You could very well be eating a retired omnibus horse. The great historical debate here is similar to the one about pies. Was this a case of criminal deception or economic necessity? Many historians argue that the sausage was an almost brilliant, if unappetizing, invention of the urban age. It took unsellable waste products, stale bread, meat scraps, tofu, and transformed them into a cheap, calorie-dense, and flavorful food source for the poor. In this view, the sausage was not a fraud. It was an innovation, a pragmatic solution to the problem of urban hunger and waste. You knew you were not buying prime pork. You were buying a banker, and you accepted what that entailed. Other scholars take a harsher view. They point to the deliberate concealment of spoiled meat and illegal horse meat as clear evidence of fraud. They argue that this was not just about using leftovers. It was about knowingly selling potentially dangerous food to people who had no other choice. The heavy seasoning was not just for flavor. It was an active agent of deception, designed to cover the taste of rot. The reality, for the consumer, was that you were buying a product on faith. You trusted your local butcher not to be using the absolute worst ingredients, but you had no way of ever being sure. You look at the half-eaten sausage in your hand, the bready texture, the peppery kick, the high fat content. It all makes sense now. It was designed to be filling and cheap, a marvel of frugal engineering. But the thought of what might be lurking beneath the spice, spoiled meat, diseased offal, or even the ghost of a London cab horse, is enough to make you lose your appetite once again. You have tried bread, milk, sweets, tea, pies, and now sausage. Each time, you have encountered a system of adulteration, recycling, or deception. It is a relentless pattern. The city's food supply seems to be a giant machine for turning waste and chemicals into something that vaguely resembles food. You drop the rest of the sausage. You are no longer just hungry. You are weary, weary of the constant vigilance, the suspicion, the gamble. You need a break, a refuge. And in 19th century London, for a working man, there was one obvious place to go for that: the pub. The relentless culinary disappointments have left you feeling drained and demoralized. You need a place to sit down, to escape the jostling crowds and the oppressive street smells. You need a refuge, and all around you, on nearly every corner, you see the glowing gas lights and frosted glass windows of public houses. The pub. It was the living room, the social club, and the escape for millions of London's working class. From within, you can hear the low hum of conversation, punctuated by the occasional burst of laughter. It seems like a sanctuary. You push open the heavy wooden door of one, a place with a simple sign, "The King's Head," and step inside. The air is thick with the smell of stale beer, tobacco smoke, and damp wool. But it is a relief from the coal, choked air outside. The room is dimly lit, the wooden floor covered in sawdust to soak up spills. A long bar dominates one wall, and a collection of men, and a few women, are clustered in small groups, nursing glasses of beer or porter. The atmosphere is loud but not aggressive. It feels, for the first time today, almost welcoming. You approach the bar. You do not want anything complicated, just a beer. It is the drink of the people, the fuel of the city's laborers. You slide a coin across the sticky bar top and ask for a pint. The public draws it from a large wooden cask, a dark, almost black liquid with a thin, brownish head. He slides the heavy glass mug toward you. It feels solid and real. You take a sip. It is weak, watery. It has the bitter, roasted flavor of a porter or a stout. But it is thin, lacking the rich, malty body you would expect. It tastes like the ghost of a good beer. You are not drunk, but you are definitely being had. You have just encountered yet another universal practice of Victorian commerce, the watering down of alcohol. This is the fundamental, mainstream truth of the Victorian pub. Publicans, like the bakers and the milk sellers, were in a constant struggle for profit. The easiest way to increase their margin on a cask of beer was to make it last longer. Before serving, many would simply top up the cask with water, sometimes increasing the volume by a significant percentage. This practice was so common it had its own slang term, flogging the barrel. But just like with the milk, simply adding water created a problem. The resulting beer was pale and weak. So, to restore the color and flavor, a whole host of other ingredients were added. To bring back the dark color of a porter, they would add burnt sugar or molasses. To mimic the bitter taste that was lost, they would add this is where it gets interesting. The bitterness in beer comes from hops, but hops were expensive. A much cheaper alternative was a substance called bitter extract or, more ominously, brewer's druggist compounds. And this brings us to our weird, little-known fact of the pub. A common ingredient in these bittering agents was a highly toxic berry from the Levant called Cocculus indicus. This berry contained a potent neurotoxin called pukrotikin. In small doses, it induced a state of intoxication that mimicked the effects of alcohol, while also adding a sharp, bitter flavor. So, the publican could water down his beer, losing alcohol content, and then add a dash of pukrotikin to make the customer feel just as drunk as they expected to. It was a poison that stretched profits by faking potency. Other additives included licorice for sweetness and body, and even a dash of salt, which had the clever effect of making the customers thirsty, encouraging them to buy more of the doctored drink. The historical debate here is not about whether this happened. It is thoroughly documented in parliamentary reports and the writings of reformers like Frederick Accum. The debate is about how the public perceived it. Did the average drinker know their beer was a chemical soup? Some historians argue that drinkers were highly discerning. They knew their local pubs and could tell a good pint from a bad one. A publican who got too greedy with the water or the additives would lose his customers to the pub down the street. In this view, the market exerted its own form of quality control. Other historians argue that for many, there was little choice. In a neighborhood controlled by a single brewery, the tied house system was just beginning. You drank what was on offer. Furthermore, the slow, cumulative health effects of ingesting things like percrotican would have been impossible to trace back to the beer. A man suffering from dizzy spells or tremors would have no idea it was caused by the bittering agent in his daily pint. He might just think it was a symptom of hard work and poor living. The general malaise of city life. You take another sip of your watery, vaguely bitter beer. The knowledge of what could be in its hours the taste completely. The pub, which seemed like a sanctuary, is just another station in this city-wide network of deception. The laughter around you suddenly sounds a bit more desperate. Are these men laughing to escape their troubles? Or because they are being slowly intoxicated by a poisonous berry? You look around the room and notice some patrons are not drinking beer. They are drinking a clear spirit from small glasses. Gin. And the state they are in is far worse than a gentle beer buzz. Their eyes are glassy, their movements erratic. It is a cheaper, faster, and much more destructive route of escape. And you realize that if the beer is this compromised, the cheap gin must be a horror story all its own. Your disappointing beer sits half-finished on the bar. The boisterous atmosphere of the pub, which at first seemed like a refuge, now feels tinged with a quiet desperation. Your eyes are drawn again to the patrons drinking gin. You watch a woman in the corner, her clothes ragged, her hair askew, pour a small measure of the clear liquid down her throat with a grim finality. Her shoulders slump, and a vacant look comes over her face. This is not social drinking. This is self-medication. You are witnessing the infamous London gin craze, a phenomenon that had ebbed and flowed for over a century, but was still a potent force in the city as poorest districts. The spirit in those glasses was not the fancy, botanical-infused craft gin you might know today. This was Blue Ruin, or Mother's Ruin, a cheap, industrial-grade spirit that offered the quickest and most brutal escape from the miseries of daily life. Curiosity, and a desire to understand this cornerstone of London's underbelly, gets the better of you. You decide you need to see it up close. You would not dare drink it, but you want to smell it, to understand its appeal. You push your beer aside and order a small measure of the cheapest gin. The publican pours it from a large, unlabeled stone jar into a small, grimy glass. The liquid is clear, but with a slightly oily sheen. You lift it to your nose. The smell is harsh and fiery. There is a faint whiff of juniper, the berry that is supposed to be the primary flavoring of gin. But beneath that is a raw, chemical smell, like turpentine or paint stripper. It is sharp and unpleasant, the kind of smell that makes your eyes water. This is not a fine spirit. It is a chemical weapon. The mainstream historical fact is that this gin was often little more than crudely distilled industrial alcohol, raw and unrefined. To make it palatable, and to stretch the volume, it was flavored with a variety of potent, and often toxic, additives. Juniper berries were the traditional flavoring, but they were expensive. So, to create that characteristic gin flavor, distillers and publicans turned to cheaper, more aggressive substitutes. This is where we find our particularly grim and specific little fact. A common additive to cheap gin was oil of turpentine, distilled from pine resin. Turpentine has a sharp, pine-like scent that could, to an undiscerning palate, mimic the botanical aroma of juniper. It was also incredibly cheap. Of course, it is also a poison, a paint solvent that is toxic when ingested, causing kidney damage and central nervous system depression. Another flavoring agent was sulfuric acid, added in small quantities to give the gin a kick or a bite. This corrosive acid would burn the throat, a sensation that was often mistaken for the potency of high-proof alcohol. So, the glass in your hand contains a potential cocktail of low-grade alcohol, turpentine, and a dash of sulfuric acid. It was a recipe for oblivion, designed to be as cheap and as potent as possible. William Hogarth's famous 18th century engraving, Gin Lane, depicted a scene of utter social collapse fueled by the spirit. Mothers ignoring their dying babies, people selling their clothes for another drink, widespread death and despair. While your mid-19th century pub scene may not be quite as apocalyptic as Hogarth's vision, the same destructive force is clearly at play. The academic debate on this subject often revolves around the social and economic causes of such widespread alcoholism. Was it a moral failing on the part of the poor? As many Victorian reformers and temperance campaigners argued, they saw in drinking as a sign of weak character, a sinful indulgence that kept people trapped in poverty. From this perspective, the solution was moral instruction, religious conversion, and total abstinence. However, a more modern school of historical thought sees the gin epidemic not as the cause of poverty, but as a symptom of it. They argue that for people living in squalid, overcrowded housing, working grueling 14-hour days in dangerous factories, and facing constant hunger and disease, gin was not an indulgence. It was a rational, if tragic, choice. It was a form of anesthetic. It numbed the physical pain of exhaustion and injury, the emotional pain of losing a child, a common tragedy, and the gnawing anxiety of living on the brink of starvation. In this view, people did not drink because they were immoral. They drank because their reality was intolerable. The gin was not the problem. The gin was a terrible solution to an even more terrible problem. You place the glass of gin back on the bar, untouched. The acrid smell alone is enough to make you feel ill. You look at the woman in the corner again. You no longer see a drunkard. You see a person who has made a desperate calculation and chosen a few hours of chemical numbness over the sharp, unending pain of her existence. The pub is no longer a sanctuary. It is a place that profits from deception and despair, selling watered-down beer to the weary and poison-laced spirits to the broken. You have had enough. You turn and push your way out of the pub, back into the cold, damp air of the street. You feel more sober and more troubled than when you went in. The search for simple nourishment has led you down a rabbit hole of adulteration, and the search for simple refuge has led you to a den of chemical despair. You need to get away from the processed, the brewed, and the distilled. Maybe the answer lies in something that looks preserved, something in a jar. You are back on the street, the harsh smell of cheap gin still stinging your nostrils. You have had it with bread, milk, meat, and drink. Every attempt at consuming something processed has been a journey into chemical fraud. Maybe the key is to avoid anything that can be easily mixed, mashed, or brewed. Maybe you need something whole, something preserved. Your eyes catch on a grocer's window display. It is more upscale than the last one, with neatly arranged tins and jars. Among the You see a jar of pickles. They are a brilliant, vibrant green, not the dull olive green of a natural pickled cucumber, but a startlingly vivid, almost electric green. Next to them is a jar of preserved gooseberries, shining with the same unnatural hue. In the grey gloom of the London street, that color is a beacon. It screams freshness and quality to the Victorian eye. It looks crisp, sharp, and appetizing. You think, how could you possibly tamper with a whole pickle? It is a cucumber. Salt, vinegar, and spices. It is a simple, ancient method of preservation. That vibrant color must just be a sign of a particularly good recipe. A trade secret, perhaps. Feeling a strange sense of optimism, you enter the shop and buy one of the bright green pickles. The shopkeeper fishes it out of the jar with a pair of tongs and hands it to you. It feels firm and crisp. You take a bite. The crunch is satisfyingly loud. The flavor is intensely sour from the vinegar, with a sharp, metallic undertone you cannot quite place. It is not necessarily unpleasant, just artificial. The pickle is so intensely green that it almost seems to glow. You have just fallen for one of the most widespread and dangerous cosmetic tricks in the Victorian food industry. The mainstream historical fact is that this beautiful, vibrant green color was achieved by intentionally adding a poisonous copper salt to the pickling brine. The most common culprit was copper sulfate, also known as blue vitriol. When cucumbers or other fruits and vegetables were boiled in a brine containing copper sulfate, a chemical reaction occurred. The copper would bind with the chlorophyll in the plant, fixing it and creating a brilliant, stable, and completely artificial green compound. It made old, wilted vegetables look unnaturally fresh and appealing. So you are, in effect, eating a pickle that has been dyed with a toxic heavy metal. Copper sulfate is a fungicide and herbicide. Ingesting it can cause nausea, vomiting, and severe damage to the liver and kidneys. It was a poison, plain and simple, being used as a cosmetic enhancer in food. And it was not just pickles. Bottled fruits like gooseberries, green gauge plums, and even some vegetables were given the same treatment to make them look more appealing on the shelf. This leads to a specific and rather audacious little piece of historical trivia. Some cookbooks of the era did not just ignore this practice. They actively encouraged it. They would instruct home cooks on how to get that desirable green color in their own preserves. A common instruction was to boil the pickles in a brass or copper pan. The vinegar and the brine would leach copper directly from the pan into the food, creating the same chemical reaction. Sometimes, they would even tell you to throw a few copper pennies into the pot for good measure. What was seen as a dangerous adulterant when done by a manufacturer was presented as a clever kitchen hack when done at home. People were essentially poisoning their own families, all in the pursuit of a fashionable color. The academic debate here focuses on the transition from traditional, craft-based knowledge to modern, chemical understanding. For centuries, people knew that cooking acidic foods in copper pots made them greener. It was a piece of folk wisdom, passed down through generations. They did not understand the chemical mechanism or the health risks involved. The Industrial Revolution introduced new, concentrated chemical forms of copper, like copper sulfate, which made the process faster and more effective, but also more dangerous. So, were the food producers who used this method evil poisoners? Or were they simply scaling up a traditional practice, unaware of the true extent of the danger? Historians like Mary Zinn, who have studied the history of food coloring, argue that for many, it was the latter. They were operating in a pre-scientific mindset, where color was an indicator of quality, and the methods used to achieve that color were based on tradition rather than chemical analysis. The pickle maker was not thinking, "I will now add a heavy metal poison to my product." He was thinking, "I will now make my pickles a proper, handsome green." The disconnect between the intent and the result is a hallmark of the era. You hold the half-eaten pickle, the unnatural green staring back at you. The satisfying crunch now seems like the sound of you biting into a metallic salt. The sour taste is now mixed with the phantom tang of poison. You have been fooled by color. You assumed brightness meant life, freshness, and quality. In this world, you are learning. The opposite is often true. The most vibrantly colored foods are the most suspect. The beautiful green of the pickle, the dazzling red of the candy, they are not signs of quality, but masks of deception. You drop the pickle into the gutter, where it joins your sad collection of rejected food. It lies there, a shard of brilliant, toxic green in the gray muck. Your quest for something safe and whole has failed again. It seems that even the simplest of preserved vegetables has been co-opted into the system of dangerous beautification. You sigh, feeling a deep weariness. Is there anything at all? That is what it appears to be. Your eyes wander back to the grocer's window, past the pickles, and land on a block of cheese. It is a hearty, reassuring-looking block of reddish orange cheese. That seems safe. It is just cheese. Right. Your gaze is fixed on the cheese. It is a substantial, solid-looking block in the grocer's window, boasting a warm, reddish orange hue. It looks rustic and wholesome. Cheese feels ancient and elemental, a product of farm and pasture, not of a factory or a chemical works. This, surely, must be a safe harbor in the storm of adulteration you have been navigating. It is a block of Gloucester cheese, famous for its distinctive color. You decide to risk it. You enter the shop again. The grocer seems to be getting used to you and your fleeting, single-item purchases. You ask for a small wedge of the reddish cheese. He takes the block, cuts a slice with a wire, and wraps it in paper. The cheese feels firm and slightly oily through the paper. You find a quiet spot, unwrap your purchase, and examine it. The color is deep and inviting. An earthy red orange that speaks of quality and rich, fatty milk. It smells sharp and nutty. You break off a small piece and pop it in your mouth. The texture is waxy, and the flavor is surprisingly mild, almost bland, with a faint, jaggy feel. The rich color promised a bold taste that the cheese simply does not deliver. As you let it dissolve on your tongue, you notice a subtle, unpleasant mineral aftertaste, similar to the one you tasted in the white bread, but different, more metallic. You have just ingested another of the era's most notorious poisons. The mainstream historical truth is that much of the cheese sold in London was just as adulterated as everything else. Just as bakers used alum to whiten their bread, some cheesemakers used coloring agents to make their product look more appealing and disguise inferior quality. The pale, anemic-looking cheese suggested it was made from skimmed milk, with all the valuable, fatty cream sold off separately. The rich, deep color suggested the opposite, that it was made from full-fat, high-quality milk, like a traditional double Gloucester. To achieve this desirable color without using expensive, high-quality milk, producers turned to cheap, potent dyes. The traditional, harmless coloring agent for Gloucester cheese was annatto, a plant-based dye, but annatto could be expensive, a much cheaper, and more vividly colored alternative was needed, and they found one. Read lead. This is our specific, horrifying fact. Your cheese is beautiful. Rustic blush is likely thanks to lead oxide, the bright red, highly toxic lead compound. It was a common pigment in paint, but its low cost and vibrant color made it an irresistible choice for unscrupulous food producers. Ingesting weed, as we now know, is catastrophic for human health. It is a powerful neurotoxin that attacks the brain and central nervous system. It can cause developmental issues in children, lead to severe abdominal pain, known as painter's colic, and result in permanent nerve damage, paralysis, and death. You are literally eating paint pigment. The mild, bland flavor of the cheese is a dead giveaway. The cheesemaker likely used low-quality, skimmed milk, which produces a less flavorful cheese. The red lead was added purely for cosmetic purposes, to trick the customer into thinking they were buying a premium, full-fat product. Other fillers, like potato flour or chalk, might also have been added to the cheese to increase its weight and bulk, contributing to that waxy, slightly gritty texture. The academic debate around this particular adulteration is fascinating. It questions the very nature of authenticity in food. What makes a Gloucester cheese a Gloucester cheese? Is it the place it is made, the type of milk used, or is it simply the color? Historians like Cole and Spencer argue that in a world of rapid urbanization, most city dwellers had lost their connection to the countryside and the true origins of their food. They had never seen a traditional cheese being made. Their only guide to quality was appearance. For these urban consumers, the reddish color was the most important characteristic of the cheese. A cheesemaker who produced a pale, but chemically pure, cheese might find it unsellable, while his competitor, selling a lead-dyed but beautifully colored block, would thrive. This created a perverse incentive system where the most deceptive product was the most successful. The producers were not just cheating the customers. They were responding to a distorted market demand, a demand for an aesthetic that had become detached from the actual quality of the food itself. Who is more to blame? The one who supplies the poison, or the market that demands the color at any cost? It is a classic chicken and egg problem of industrial food production. You quickly spit out the mouthful of cheese. The mineral-icy aftertaste now feels like a fire alarm on your tongue. Lead. You have eaten lead. The sheer audacity of it is staggering. It is not just about cheating someone out of a few pennies. It is about a fundamental disregard for human life in the pursuit of profit. But cheese, which looks so honest and solid, is perhaps the most insidious deception you have encountered yet. The poison is not just an additive. It is woven into the very identity of the product. You look at the wedge of cheese in your hand. The warm, inviting color now looks like a skull and crossbones. You feel a growing sense of paranoia. You cannot trust the appearance of anything. White bread is a lie. Green pickles are a lie. Red cheese is a lie. The entire visual language of food has been hijacked and corrupted. To survive here, you cannot trust your eyes, your nose, or your taste buds. So what can you trust? You wrap the cheese back up and drop it. You are not just hungry anymore. You are starting to feel genuinely unsafe, as if the whole city is engaged in a conspiracy to poison you. One bite at a time, defeated and increasingly paranoid, you abandon the idea of prepared foods altogether. The shops, the stalls, the pubs, they are all traps. Every item has been a disguise, a cleverly packaged lie. If you cannot trust bread, pickles, or cheese, then the only logical step is to go back to the source. You decide you will buy the raw ingredients yourself and prepare them. It is the only way to be sure. You need a proper market. You ask for directions and are pointed towards one of London's bustling street markets. As you approach, the noise level rises. It is a chaotic, open-air emporium of life. Stalls are crammed together, selling everything from second-hand clothes and cheap tools to wilted vegetables and glistening fish. The air is thick with the cries of vendors, the smell of produce, some fresh, some not so much, and the crush of hundreds of shoppers. This feels more elemental, more honest. Here, you can look a seller in the eye. You can pick out your own potato, your own onion. You decide to start with something simple. Vegetables. You find a stall piled high with potatoes, carrots, and cabbages. You begin to pick out a few potatoes, but the vendor, a fast-talking man with darting eyes, quickly intercepts you. None of that. J-U-V-N-R, he says, smiling a little too broadly. You point. I pick. Best ones for you. Promise. He quickly scoops a bunch of potatoes into a bag, weighs them on a rusty-looking scale, and names a price. The whole transaction is over before you have had a chance to properly inspect what you are buying. You walk away and look into your bag. The potatoes on top look fine, but underneath are smaller, bruised ones, some with soft, dark spots already forming. You have just experienced one of the oldest tricks in the book. This is the mainstream historical reality of the Victorian market. It was a battle of wits between buyer and seller, and the seller had all the advantages. The most common form of deception was simply giving you inferior goods. What was known as the topping or facing trick. The best-looking produce would be placed at the front of the display, while the older, damaged goods were hidden at the back or bottom. By not letting you pick your own, the vendor could offload his worst stock onto unsuspecting customers. Then, there was the issue of weights and measures. The scales you saw were often rigged. A common trick was to have a hollowed-out, weighted scoop, or to place a piece of lead or iron under the weighing pan. The customer would be paying for, say, a pound of potatoes, but only receiving 12 or 14 ounces. Short measures were also rampant with liquids. A pint pot might have a full sputum, making it look larger than it was. These practices were illegal, but inspectors were few and far between, and the penalties were often minor. For many vendors, the profit from cheating far outweighed the risk of getting caught. And here is a specific, lesser-known scam you might fall for. The painted sparrows. In the market, you might see a vendor selling what look like small, colorful songbirds, advertised as a delicacy. In reality, these were often just common city sparrows, which had been caught, killed, and then painstakingly painted with colored pigments to resemble more exotic and expensive birds, like canaries or bullfinches. It was a purely cosmetic fraud, playing on the customer's desire for a small, affordable luxury. The historical debate in this area revolves around the idea of the moral economy. This is a concept proposed by the historian E.P. Thompson. He argued that in pre-industrial times, there was a sort of unwritten social contract between sellers and the community. Prices should be fair, and goods should be of a certain quality. When these norms were violated, it could lead to public anger and even food riots. So, the question is, did this moral economy survive in the anonymous chaos of industrial London? Some historians argue that it did, in a fractured way. A shopper would have their trusted vendors, people they knew would not cheat them, or at least, would not cheat them too much. Reputation was still a form of currency. But other historians argue that the sheer scale and anonymity of the London markets destroyed this old system. Transactions were fleeting, A vendor could cheat 100 different strangers a day and never see them again. The old community-based trust was replaced by a new, cynical caveat-emptor mentality. Let the buyer beware. In this dog-eat-dog world, cheating was not just a temptation. For some, it was a survival strategy. You clutch your bag of sand potatoes. Feeling foolish, you came to the market to take control, to escape the deceptions of processed food. Instead, you have just been cheated in a much more direct, personal way. You have been outsmarted by a fast-talking vegetable seller. It is a small-scale swindle, but it feels deeply frustrating. It reinforces the lesson that in this city, you are always the outsider, the mark. You look around the chaotic market. Every transaction seems like a small performance, a contest. A fishmonger sprinkles water on his fish to make them look fresher and heavier. A woman selling butter presses a decorative stamp onto her bats, a mark of quality that means nothing. It is a theater of minor deceptions. You realize that even here, at the supposed source, the system is rigged. The problem is not just what is in the food. It is in the very way the food is sold. Your simple plan to buy raw ingredients has hit a snag at the first step. You have not even made it to the meat or the dairy stalls yet. And as you look down at your bruised potatoes, a horrifying thought occurs to you. Where does the water that the fishmonger is using actually come from? That question hangs in the air, chilling you more than the damp London fog that is starting to roll in. The water, the fishmonger splashing his wares, the vegetable seller rinsing his carrots, the hot water you bought for your fraudulent tea. Where does it all come from? You look down the crowded market street, towards the grey, sluggish river you smelled upon your arrival, the Thames. You start to walk towards it, drawn by a morbid need to confront the source. As you get closer, the smell intensifies. It is a complex, foul odor of decay, chemicals, and human waste. You stand on the embankment and look down at the water. It is not clear, or even murky brown. It is an opaque, greasy, gray-black, with unit and phytobolt debris floating slowly on its surface. A slick, oily film shimmers on top. This is not just a river. It is a liquid entity, a monstrous, living soup of the city's refuse. This is the central, unavoidable historical fact of mid-19th century London. The River Thames was the city's main artery and its main sewer. There was no comprehensive, city-wide sewage system as we know it today. The old cesspits beneath the houses were overflowing. The newer, improved water closets that were becoming popular simply channeled household waste directly into the old sewer network, which had been designed only for rainwater and emptied. You guessed it. Straight into the Thames. All the waste of millions of people. Their sewage, their industrial effluent, their garbage, was being dumped, untreated, into the river. At the same time, the private water companies that supplied London with its drinking water were drawing their supply from that very same river. Often, a company's water intake pipe would be just a few yards downstream from a major sewage outfall. The filtration methods they used were rudimentary at best. Little more than letting the water settle in a reservoir to allow the most solid bits to sink. You are looking at the city's toilet and its drinking fountain. All in one. This brings us to a specific and truly disgusting tidbit about the river. It was so full of organic matter that in the hot summer months, it would begin to ferment. Bubbles of methanized hydrogen sulfide would rise from the riverbed, and the stench was so overpowering it could cause people to vomit. During the Great Stink of 1858, the river's condition became a national emergency. The smell was thought to be miasma, a toxic vapor that people believed spread disease. While the miasma theory was incorrect, it was the bacteria in the water, not the smell itself, that was the killer. It was the overpowering stench that finally forced the government to act and commission Joseph Basiletich's revolutionary sewer system. But that is still years in the future for you. Right now, you are looking at the river in its full, festering glory. The historical debate surrounding this topic is not about the pollution itself, but about the delay in fixing it. Why did it take so long? Historians point to a perfect storm of obstacles. Firstly, there was the sheer scale and expense of the project. Building a modern sewer system for the world's largest city was a monumental undertaking. Secondly, there was a fierce political battle between the dozens of local parishes and authorities who governed London. They could not agree on who should be responsible or who should pay. Thirdly, there was a genuine scientific debate. No one was entirely sure how diseases like cholera and typhoid were spread. The miasma theory held sway for a long time, so efforts were focused on eliminating smells rather than cleaning the water. It took the dogged work of pioneers like Dr. John Snow, who famously traced the 1854 cholera outbreak to the Broad Street water pump, to prove the waterborne theory, and it took the sheer, unignorable horror of the great stink to finally overcome the political and financial inertia. It is a classic story of a government ignoring a creeping crisis until it becomes an acute, unavoidable catastrophe that lands, quite literally, on its own doorstep. You stand there, watching the foul water slap against the stone embankment, and everything clicks into place. The watery milk you were sold was not just a cheat. It was potentially laced with cholera from the river water used to dilute it. The fish on the slab, freshened with a splash of that same water, were being coated in pathogens. The vegetables, rinsed in a bucket filled from a nearby pump, could be contaminated. Even the beer, watered down in the pub cellar, was part of this vast, interconnected web of filth. The river is the secret ingredient in everything. It is the invisible sauce that covers the entire city's diet. The individual acts of adulteration, the chalk, the lead, the alum, are shocking in their own right. But this is something far more fundamental. This is a systemic poisoning. The city's own lifeblood is toxic. You feel a profound sense of hopelessness. Your quest for a safe meal seems utterly naive now. It is not about finding the one honest vendor or the one pure product. The contamination is everywhere. It is in the water, which means it is in everything. You could buy the freshest, most honest ingredients from the most reputable seller, but the moment you wash them, you are reintroducing the danger. You feel a familiar, unwelcome churning in your own stomach. Is it hunger? Or is it the alum from the bread, the copper from the pickle, or just the psychosomatic effect of staring into this horrifying river? You cannot tell. All you know is that you feel unwell. You turn away from the river, but you cannot leave the feeling of it behind. It is a sickness that has seeped into your own body, a low-grade, churning malaise in the pit of your stomach. It is not a sharp pain, not a sudden cramp. It is a persistent, draining discomfort, a general feeling of being unwell. You lean against a damp brick wall, closing your eyes for a moment, trying to take stock. As you stand there, you start to notice the people around you with a new, empathetic eye. You see a woman pressing a hand to her stomach as she hurries down the street. You overhear two men talking, one complaining of a dicky tummy that has been bothering him for days. A child sitting on a doorstep is pale and listless, its mother looking on with a worried frown. You are not alone in your discomfort. This feeling, this constant, Low-level gastrointestinal distress is the default state for many people in this city. This is the grim, mainstream historical reality of life in industrial London. Food poisoning was not a rare, unfortunate event. It was a chronic, everyday experience. The Victorians had a host of names for it: gastric fever, summer complaint, bowel complaint, indigestion. For most, it was simply a part of life, an unavoidable consequence of eating. They did not have the scientific framework of germ theory to understand that their daily meals were waging a constant war on their immune systems. The combination of factors was relentless. The bacterial load from contaminated water and milk, the chemical irritation from alum in bread and copper in pickles, the potential for rotten disease in poorly preserved meat, the indigestible fillers like chalk and plaster of Paris. The human body can only take so much. The result was a population suffering from endemic digestive problems. This chronic state of being unwell had profound consequences. It meant lost wages for workers who were too sick to go to the factory. It meant malnourished children who were more susceptible to other, more deadly diseases like tuberculosis or scarlet fever. It was a constant drain on the city's vitality, a hidden tax paid by its poorest citizens. Now for the more specific, and in some ways more poignant, little-known fact. One of the most common remedies for these stomach complaints was, ironically, another product sold by the same chemists and grocers who peddled the adulterants. These were patent medicines, things like Godfrey's cordial or Daffy's elixir. These popular tonics were advertised as cures for everything from colic in babies to indigestion in adults. What the public did not know was that their primary active ingredient was oft an opium, in the form of laudanum, a tincture of opium in alcohol. So, when a mother gave her crying baby Godfrey's cordial for its tummy ache, likely caused by alum-laced bread or contaminated milk, she was essentially giving it a dose of narcotics. The opium would dull the pain and induce a state of stupor, making the baby quiet and sleepy. The mother, relieved, would think the medicine had worked. In reality, she was just masking the symptoms of the underlying poisoning while potentially addicting her child to opiates. It was a vicious cycle. The food made you sick, and the cure was a narcotic that did nothing to solve the problem, only silenced the complaint. The historical debate here is a profound one, touching on the very consciousness of the past. How did people rationalize this constant sickness? Did they live in a state of perpetual fear and anxiety about their food? Or did they achieve a level of acceptance and fatalism that is hard for us to imagine? Some social historians argue that the constant proximity to illness and death created a different psychological landscape. A dicky tummy was a minor inconvenience in a world where a small cut could lead to a fatal infection and could wipe out a neighborhood in a week. People simply did not have the luxury of our modern health anxieties. They accepted a certain level of physical suffering as part of the human condition. Other historians, reading personal diaries and letters from the period, find evidence of deepened, persistent anxiety. They find people meticulously recording their digestive troubles, sharing cures with friends, and expressing a clear desire for safe, wholesome food. They argue that the fatalism was a coping mechanism, not a lack of concern. People were acutely aware that their environment was making them sick, but they felt powerless to change it. They were wrapped in a system they could not control, and their bodily discomfort was the physical manifestation of that powerlessness. Your own churning stomach feels like a direct connection to that past, a physical embodiment of the historical record. It is no longer an abstract concept. It is a real, unpleasant sensation. You understand now that the story of food in this era is not just a catalog of scams and poisons. It is the story of the human body under siege. It is about the quiet, daily suffering of millions, the chronic unease that formed the background music of their lives. This realization is, in its own way, more disturbing than the shock of any single adulterant. It is the sheer, grinding, attritional nature of it all. It was not just about the risk of a sudden, dramatic poisoning. It was about the certainty of a slow, steady erosion of health and well-being. But even in the darkest of times, there are always those who fight back, not with riots or revolutions, but with a weapon that would prove to be far more powerful in the long run: a microscope. The persistent, queasy discomfort in your gut serves as a powerful reminder of the invisible war being waged in the food supply. You feel helpless, a single victim in a city of millions. But as you wander through the streets, lost in this fog of malaise, you hypothetically stumble upon a new kind of establishment. It is not a shop or a pub. It is a doctor's office. And through the window, you see a man hunched over a brass instrument, his eye pressed to a lens. He is meticulously examining something on a glass slide. This man represents the beginning of the end for the age of adulteration. You are meeting Drive, Arthur Hill Hassel. Hassel was a physician and a chemist, but most importantly, he was a master of a relatively new and powerful tool: the microscope. In the 1852, the microscope was still largely a research instrument, not something used for practical applications like food analysis. But Hassel had a revolutionary idea. He realized that the microscope could make the invisible visible. It could reveal the secrets that were hidden inside London's food. This is the mainstream historical fact. Arthur Hill Hassel was the pioneer who used scientific analysis to systematically expose food adulteration. He began his work in the early 1852s, driven by a scientific curiosity and a growing sense of social justice. He started by examining coffee. It was widely known that coffee was often adulterated, but no one knew the exact scale of the problem. Shopkeepers would bulk up their expensive coffee beans with cheaper roasted chicory. Hassel put samples of commercial coffee under his microscope. What he saw was undeniable. Under magnification, the cellular structure of the coffee bean is completely different from that of the chicory root. He could clearly see the fraudulent chicory particles mixed in with the real coffee. He could not only prove that the coffee was adulterated, but he could often estimate the percentage of the fraud. He did not stop at coffee. He moved on to tea. Under his lens, the graphite used to face the recycled teal leaves revealed itself as a collection of dark, crystalline specks, completely alien to the natural structure of the leaf. He examined sugar and found it teeming with dust, dirt, and even a grotesque-looking microscopic mite, Agarus saccharine, that thrived in the raw, unrefined sugar sold to the poor. He looked at the bright green pickles and found the telltale crystalline structures of copper sulfate. He put a drop of watered-down milk on a slide and saw the chalk particles and the swarming bacteria from the contaminated water. This leads us to a fascinating, little-known aspect of his work: its visual power. Hassel was not just a scientist. He was a brilliant communicator. He knew that a dry, scientific report would not capture the public's imagination. So he hired artists to create detailed engravings of what he saw through his microscope. These images were evolutionary. For the first time, the public could see the fraud. They could see the jagged chicory cells mixed with their coffee, the insect-like mites crawling in their sugar, the alien chemical crystals in their pickles. These images were published alongside his findings, and they were shocking, visceral, and unforgettable. They transformed the abstract concept of adulteration into a concrete, Visual horror. The historical debate surrounding Hass's work often centers on his methods and motivations. Was he a purely objective scientist? Or was he a crusading social reformer with an agenda? Some of his critics at the time accused him of sensationalism. They argued that he cherry-picked the worst examples and presented them as the norm, unfairly damaging the reputation of honest tradesmen. They claimed he was an alarmist who was creating a panic. More modern historians, however, see him as a new type of public intellectual. He was a scientist who understood that data alone was not enough. To create change, you had to engage the public and pressure the politicians. He skillfully used the media of his day to publicize his findings and build a case for government intervention. He was not just practicing science. He was practicing a new form of scientific activism. He understood that seeing is believing, and he used his microscope as a weapon to force an unwilling public and a reluctant government to confront the ugly truth about what they were eating. His work represents a pivotal moment when science stepped out of the laboratory and became a powerful tool for consumer protection. As you watch Drive, Hassel at his work, a flicker of hope ignites within you. The queasiness in your stomach is still there, but it is now mixed with a sense of vindication. The widespread, systemic deception you have experienced feels overwhelming and unbeatable. But this man, with his brass and glass instrument, is proving that it is not. He is showing that the truth can be found, that lies can be exposed. The baker can lie about his bread, the grocer can lie about his tea, but the cellular structure of chalk or the crystalline form of lead seen under a microscope cannot. The poisons and fillers that seem so insidious and hidden are being dragged out into the light. Dr. Hassel is creating a new kind of evidence, an objective, scientific proof of a crime that, until now, had been almost impossible to prosecute. His work is a quiet but profound revolution, and it is not just staying in his office. It is about to explode into the public consciousness. Thanks to one of Britain's most prestigious medical journals, the work of Dr. Hassel, that quiet revolution happening under the lens of his microscope was too important to remain confined to a small laboratory. It needed a platform, a voice that could reach the influential ears of Parliament, the medical community, and the educated public. That platform came in the form of one of Britain's most respected and powerful medical journals, The Lancet. You find yourself in a hypothetical London reading room. The air is quiet, smelling of old paper and leather bindings. A man nearby is engrossed in a fresh copy of The Lancet. You glance over his shoulder, and you see it. A series of articles under the stark, commanding title, The Lancet Analytical Sanitary Commission. This was the vehicle that would turn Drive, Hassel's private research into a public crusade. The mainstream historical fact is that in 1851, Thomas Wegley, the founder and editor of The Lancet, commissioned Hassel to conduct a comprehensive, systematic investigation into the state of London's food supply. Wegley was a radical reformer and a member of Parliament, and he knew that this issue was a festering wound on the nation's health. The Commission's findings were published weekly in The Lancet for 4 years. From 1851 to 1854, it was a sensation. Each week, the journal would tackle a new foodstuff: coffee, then sugar, then bread, tea, milk, cheese, beer, and so on. Hassel's meticulous scientific analysis was presented in clear, accessible language, but what made this series so explosive was one audacious detail. They named names. This was not a general report about anonymous, shadowy adulterators. The Lancet listed the specific names on the addresses of the shops from which the samples were purchased. and detailed exactly what fraudulent substances were found in their products. Imagine the impact. A respectable grocer on Oxford Street, who had built a reputation for quality, would suddenly find his name in print. His fine salon coffee exposed as being 50% chicory. A baker proud of his pure white bread would be publicly identified as selling loaves bulked up with alum. It was a brutal, but incredibly effective strategy. It was trial by publication. For the first time, individual businesses were held directly accountable for their practices. The report was a weekly roll call of shame, and the commercial world was terrified. This leads to a specific and interesting little detail about the backlash. The accused merchants did not take this lying down. They fought back. They wrote furious letters to the editor. They published pamphlets denouncing Hassel and Wackley, and some even filed lawsuits for libel. One of the most famous cases involved a company that sold preserved anchovies. Hassel-less analysis found that their bright red anchovy paste, a popular delicacy, was colored with a huge amount of a substance called Venetian reed, which he identified as containing red lead. The company sued, creating a tense legal battle. This highlights the risk Hassel and the Lancet were taking. They were not just scientists. They were investigative journalists, and they were making powerful enemies. The historical debate surrounding this series often focuses on its ethics and its impact. Were the name and shame tactics of the Lancet a fair or responsible form of journalism? Some contemporaries, and even some modern historians, argue that it was a form of vigilantism that bypassed the legal system. It could destroy a business's reputation overnight, based on the analysis of a single sample, with no formal process for appeal. They argue that it created an atmosphere of fear and mistrust, and that some of the accused may have been innocent victims of a contaminated supply chain, rather than deliberate fraudsters. However, the dominant historical view is that these aggressive tactics were a necessary evil. Decades of gentle persuasion, moral appeals, and smaller, anonymous reports had failed to produce any meaningful change. The government was paralyzed by a laissez-faire ideology that resisted interfering in private commerce. Wackley and Hassel understood that the only way to force change was to create a public scandal so big they could not be ignored. By naming names, they weaponized consumer choice. Shoppers could now use the weekly reports as a guide, rewarding the honest vendors, whose products were also listed and praised, and shunning the dishonest ones. They created a market-based incentive for honesty where none had existed before. As you read these reports, you can feel the power shift. The balance of information, which had been so heavily tilted in favor of the seller, is starting to even out. The cloak of anonymity that protected the adulterator is being torn away, one weekly publication at a time. The work of the Analytical Sanitary Commission was a landmark moment in the history of consumer rights. It established the principle that the public had a right to know what was in their food, and it demonstrated the power of independent, scientific investigation to hold industry to account. The queasy feeling in your stomach has not gone away, but your sense of powerlessness is beginning to recede. Change is possible. The truth, armed with a microscope and a printing press, is a formidable force. The reports in the Lancet are sending shockwaves through London's commercial and political elite. But what about those at the very bottom of the social ladder? For those who could not afford to choose their grocer, for those whose only option was the parish workhouse, their diet was being shaped by a very different, and much more chilling, kind of science. The revelations in the Lancet are creating a storm in the world of commerce and politics. But your journey now takes you to a place far removed from reading rooms and respectable grocers. It takes you to a place where food is not a commodity to be bought and sold. but it too loves social control. You find yourself standing before a large, grim, brick building, surrounded by high walls. There are no signs, no welcoming doors. This is a workhouse, or as the poor called it, the Bastille. This was the institution of last resort for the destitute, the homeless, the elderly, and the orphaned. You step inside, and the atmosphere is one of stark, oppressive order. The air is cold and smells of disinfectant and boiled cabbage. The residents, dressed in drab, uniform-like clothing, move about in silence, their faces etched with a profound weariness. There is no laughter, no chatter, only the shuffling of feet and the cold echo of authority. Your hunger, which has been a constant companion, now feels like a liability, a weakness that could land you in a place like this permanently. You are here to experience the ultimate expression of the Victorian science of diet, the workhouse menu. The foundational historical fact you need to understand is the Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834. This law was a radical and brutal overhaul of the welfare system. Its primary goal was to reduce the cost of looking after the poor and to deter people from seeking help. It established the principle of less eligibility, which meant that the conditions inside the workhouse had to be deliberately worse than the conditions of the poorest independent laborer outside. This principle applied to everything: the accommodation, the work, and especially the food. The workhouse diet was not designed to be nutritious or enjoyable. It was scientifically engineered to be as cheap, monotonous, and unappealing as possible, while still providing just enough calories to fuel a day of hard, pointless labor, like breaking rocks or picking oakum, and rattling old tarred ropes. The Poor Law Commissioners in London issued detailed dietary tables, specifying the exact amount of food each class of inmate, man, woman, child, was to receive for every single meal, every single day of the week. Here is a specific, chilling little fact that illustrates the philosophy behind this. The diets were often intentionally low in protein and fat, and heavy on carbohydrates like bread and gruel. This was not just about cost. Some workhouse theorists, like Sir Edwin Chadwick, believed that a protein-rich diet made the poor insolent and rebellious. A low-protein, carb-heavy diet, they argued, would make the paupers more placid and docile, easier to manage. The food was literally a tool for behavioral control. They were not feeding people. They were fueling machines and suppressing spirits. Let us look at a typical day's menu. For breakfast, every single day, you would receive a pint of gruel and a chunk of dry bread. For lunch, you might get more bread and a small piece of cheese on 2 days, and on the other days, a watery soup or stew with a few scraps of meat and potatoes. For dinner, it was back to bread and cheese or bread and broth. The menu was a relentless, soul-crushing rotation of the same few miserable items. There was no variety, no flavor, no joy. The historical debate here is a heated one. Did the creators of this system, men like Chadwick, genuinely believe they were acting in the best interests of society? Or was this a system of calculated cruelty, designed to punish people for the crime of being poor? Some historians argue for the former. They suggest that these reformers were driven by utilitarian logic. They saw the old poor law system as corrupt and inefficient, encouraging idleness. They believed that by making the workhouse a place of last resort, they were encouraging self-reliance and reducing the burden on the taxpayer. In their minds, the harsh diet was a rational, if unpleasant, part of a logical system designed for the greater good. Other historians, however, see the workhouse diet as a clear expression of class warfare. They argue that it was rooted in a deep-seated contempt for the poor, who were seen as a morally deficient, subhuman class. The diet was a form of punishment, designed to break their spirits and reinforce the social hierarchy. The monotony and blandness were not just a byproduct of cost-cutting. They were a deliberate psychological weapon. The fact that the diet was oft unnutritionally deficient, leading to scurvy and other diseases, is presented as evidence of a fundamental disregard for the inmates' lives. As you stand in the cold, silent dining hall of the workhouse, you see the inmates receiving their midday meal, a ladle of thin, brownish soup and a piece of bread. They eat it without expression, without conversation. This is not a meal. It is a ration. It is the logical endpoint of all the city's bad food. Out on the streets, the food was a chaotic, deceptive gamble. And here, the food is an exact, calculated, and perfectly legal instrument of misery. The adulterated food outside might poison your body, but the workhouse diet seems designed to poison your soul. And as you watch them spooning up their watery soup, your mind focuses on the most infamous dish of all, the very symbol of institutional poverty, the gruel, the image of the workhouse meal. That stark ration of bread and soup stays with you, but it is the thought of breakfast that truly defines the experience. Every morning, without fail, begins with gruel. The word itself has become synonymous with poverty and misery, thanks in large part to Charles Dickens's Oliver Twist. But what was it? Really? You decide you must taste this infamous dish to fully understand the depths of the workhouse experience. You find yourself in the queue, a tin bowl in your hand. A large, steaming copper pot is at the head of the line, presided over by a workhouse official. As you get closer, a smell hits you. It is a faint, slightly sour, pasty smell, not entirely unpleasant, just empty. When it is your turn, the official ladles a pint of a thick, grayish, semi-liquid substance into your bowl. It plops down with a sad, gelatinous sound. You are also handed a chunk of the familiar, dense, dry bread. This is your breakfast. You take your bowl to a long wooden bench and look at it. The gruel is a lumpy, glutinous paste. There are no identifiable ingredients, just a uniform, wallpaper paste consistency. You take a spoonful. It is warm, which is something, but the flavor is almost a perfect void. It tastes of boiled water, a hint of salt, and the faint, raw taste of cheap oatmeal. The texture is the worst part. It is slimy and thick, coating your mouth in a starchy film. It is food reduced to its most basic, functional form, the warm, calorie delivery paste. The mainstream historical fact is that workhouse gruel was almost always made from oatmeal, water, and a little salt. The poor law dietaries specified the exact ratio, typically around 1.5 to 2 ounces of oatmeal per pint of water. It was boiled for a long time until the oats broke down completely, creating the thick, porridge-like consistency. It was chosen for 3 reasons. It was incredibly cheap. It was easy to make in huge quantities. And it was filling. A pint of this warm, starchy sludge would sit heavily in the stomach, creating a feeling of fullness that would, hopefully, keep the inmates from complaining of hunger for a few hours. Now for the specific, and rather revealing, little detail about its preparation. The quality of the gruel could vary enormously depending on the whim of the cook or the master of the workhouse. While the regulations specified the amount of oatmeal, they did not specify the quality. Often, the cheapest, lowest grade oatmeal, little better than animal feed, was used. Furthermore, investigations into workhouse conditions frequently found that even the official, meager ration of oatmeal was being skimped on. The master of the workhouse might sell off some of the oatmeal supplies for a personal profit, resulting in an even thinner, more watery gruel for the inmates, sometimes to give a thin gruel a thicker appearance. Less than savory things were added. Reports from the time mention finding flour sweepings from the floor or other starchy waste products being used to thicken the pot. This is what makes Oliver Twist's famous request. "Please, sir, I want some more." So powerful. He was not just asking for a second helping of a tasty meal. He was asking for more of this miserable, despised substance. His hunger was so profound that even another bowl of this gray paste was a desperate desire. His act was a rebellion not against a lack of luxury, but against a state of calculated, institutionalized starvation. The historical debate around the workhouse diet, and gruel in particular, often gets tied up in the Malthusian thinking of the era. Thomas Malthus was an economist who famously argued that population growth would always outstrip food supply, leading to inevitable famine and poverty. His ideas were highly influential among the architects of the New Poor Law. So, the debate is, was the meager workhouse diet a practical application of Malthusian theory? Some historians argue yes. They believe the lawmakers saw poverty and hunger as natural checks on the surplus population. By providing only the barest minimum for survival, they were refusing to interfere with this natural process. The gruel was not just about saving money. It was a tool of population control, a way to ensure that only the hardiest and most desperate survived the system. Other historians argue that this gives the Poor Law Commissioners too much intellectual credit. They suggest the motives were simpler and more brutal. Class prejudice and penny pinching. They did not need a complex economic theory to justify starving the poor. They did it because they believed the poor were lazy and undeserving, and because they wanted to keep the local tax rates as low as possible. In this view, the gruel is not a symbol of Malthusian philosophy. It is a symbol of pure, unadulterated stinginess and contempt. You force down another spoonful of the slimy gruel. It fills your stomach, but it does not nourish your spirit. It is the perfect symbol of this place. It DNS the appetite, but offers no pleasure, no comfort, no hope. It is food as punishment. The difference between the adulterated food on the streets and the workhouse gruel is the difference between chaos and order. The street food was a chaotic gamble, a wild west of private enterprise. The gruel is the opposite. It is the product of a highly ordered, rational, and bureaucratic system, and in many ways, its cold, calculated cruelty is even more terrifying. The bell rings, signaling the end of the meal. It is time for work. But as you get up, you feel a shift in the air, a whisper of change that has finally trickled down even to a place like this. The scandals, the scientific reports, the public outrage, they are starting to have an effect. The system that created this bowl of gruel is, very slowly, beginning to be questioned. You leave the oppressive silence of the workhouse behind. The taste of gruel still a ghostly film in your mouth. Back on the streets of London, something feels different. It is not a dramatic, overnight change. The air is still thick with coal smoke. The streets are still muddy, but there is a new topic of conversation in the air. A buzz of debate and argument that you can overhear in pubs, in queues, and on street corners. It is the sound of a government that has finally, reluctantly, been forced to wake up. The cumulative effect of years of scandal and pressure. From drive, has a less microscope. From the Lancet exposes, from the Bradford sweet poisoning, and from the ever-present threat of another great stink, had become impossible for Parliament to ignore. You find yourself hypothetically standing in the public gallery of the House of Commons, watching the politicians debate. The scene is one of predictable political theater. Members grandstanding, arguing over details, and expressing deep philosophical objections to the very idea of government intervention. This is the mainstream historical fact. The 1862 and 1872 saw the passage of the first meaningful food safety legislation in Britain. The landmark piece of legislation was the Adulteration of Food and Drink Act of 1860. On the surface, it sounded revolutionary. It made it illegal to sell food containing ingredients that were injurious to health. It was the first time this principle had ever been enshrined in law. However, as you watch the debate and see the final version of the act, you realize it is a classic piece of British compromise, full of loopholes and half-measures. This is our specific, slightly cynical detail. The 1860 Act was largely ineffective because it was not compulsory. It gave local authorities the option to appoint a public analyst to inspect food, but it did not require them to. Most budget-conscious local councils, unwilling to spend the money, simply did not bother. In the first 12 years of the Act's existence, only a handful of analysts were appointed across the entire country. The law had no teeth. It was a symbolic gesture, a way for Parliament to look like it was doing something, without actually doing very much at all. This leads to the central historical debate on this topic. Why was the government so resistant to regulation? The standard answer is the prevailing ideology of laissez-faire. The dominant political and economic philosophy of the era was that the government should not interfere with the free market. Business and commerce, they believed, should be left to regulate themselves through competition. Adulteration was seen as a private matter between a dishonest seller and an unwary buyer, not a problem for the state to solve. The idea of government inspectors entering shops and seizing goods was seen as a terrifying, un-English intrusion on the liberty of the individual, a step towards a French-style police state. However, some revisionist historians argue that the opposition was not just philosophical. It was deeply practical and self-interested. Many members of Parliament were themselves businessmen, merchants, or landowners with connections to the food and drink industries. Brewers, for example, were a powerful lobby group in Parliament. These MPs had a vested interest in keeping the government's regulatory hands off their businesses. They were not just defending a principle. They were protecting their profits. The fight for food safety was not just a battle of ideas. It was a class struggle between consumer advocates and powerful commercial interests. You watch as the watered-down 1860 Act is passed. It feels like a hollow victory, but it was a start. It was a crack in the wall of laissez-faire indifference, and the pressure did not let up. Over the next decade, reformers continued to campaign, pointing out the flaws in the legislation. This led to a stronger act in 1872, and finally, the Comprehensive Sale of Food and Drugs Act of 1875. This act made the appointment of public analysts mandatory. It established clearer definitions of adulteration and set tougher penalties. It was, effectively, the foundation of all modern food safety law in Britain. The change was slow, grudging, and imperfect, but it was happening. The era of unchecked adulteration, where a baker could add plaster to his bread with impunity, was slowly coming to an end. The government, which had for so long been part of the problem, was being forced to become part of the solution. This shift in the political landscape creates a new set of challenges and opportunities for the food sellers themselves. With the threat of a public analyst and a potential court case looming, the old business model of anything goes is becoming increasingly risky. The smarter, more forward-thinking manufacturers and retailers realize that they need a new way to win the customer's trust. The age of anonymous, unpackaged, adulterated goods is dying. A new age is dawning. The age of the brand. As you walk away from the hallowed, yet frustrating, halls of Parliament, you notice a subtle but significant change in the visual landscape of the city's shops. For most of your journey, food has been an anonymous commodity. It was scooped from bins, cut from large blocks, or ladled from communal pots. There was no way to trace it back to its source. But now, you start to see something new in the grocer's windows. Packaged goods. You see tins of biscuits, boxes of cocoa, and paper-wrapped bars of soap, all bearing a specific name and a distinctive design. You are witnessing the birth of branding. This is the key historical development that rose from the ashes of the adulteration crisis. With public trust in food at an all-time low and the government slowly creaking into regulatory action, a new business opportunity emerged. Clever entrepreneurs realized that in a world of rampant fraud, honesty itself could be a selling point. The way to guarantee that honesty was to seal your product in a package and put your name on it. A brand name was a promise. It was a personal guarantee from the manufacturer to the consumer. A stake of reputation that said, "What is inside this package is pure. You can trust me." You step into a grocer's shop, and it feels different from the ones you first entered. It is cleaner, better organized. On the shelves, you see names that are still familiar today. You might see a tin of cocoa from a Quaker family business, Cadbury, or a bar of soap from Pears. These early branding pioneers, many of whom were Quakers or from other nonconformist religious groups, often had a strong ethical or moral dimension to their business philosophy. They saw providing a pure, unadulterated product as a moral duty, not just a business strategy. This gives us our specific, fascinating detail. The power of the sealed package. Consider the simple biscuit. Previously, you would buy biscuits loose from a barrel, where they could be stale, broken, or contaminated. But now, you see a colorful tin from a company like Huntley & Palmer's. The tin is a technological innovation. It is airtight, protecting the biscuits from dampened pests. But it is also a piece of marketing genius. The tin is beautifully decorated, a desirable object in its own right that could be reused in the home. Most importantly, it is sealed. The seal is a guarantee that the biscuits inside are the exact same ones that left the factory, untouched by any middleman who might be tempted to swap them for inferior goods or tamper with them. The sealed package became the ultimate symbol of safety and consistency. The historical debate here concerns the true motive behind this branding revolution. Was it driven by a genuine desire to provide safe, honest products to the public, as the brand Geograph IES would have us believe? Or was it simply a brilliant marketing strategy to create consumer loyalty and justify higher prices? The traditional view often emphasizes the moral character of these founding entrepreneurs, painting them as virtuous capitalists who built their empires on a foundation of quality and trust. A more critical school of historians, however, argues that branding was primarily a tool for market control. By creating a recognizable, branded product, a manufacturer could bypass the local grocer's influence and create a direct relationship with the consumer. Advertising could build demand for Cadbury's cocoa specifically, so the customer would no longer ask for a quarter pound of cocoa, but for the branded product. This allowed the manufacturer to set prices, control quality, and build a powerful, nationwide market. In this view, the promise of purity was less a moral crusade and more calculated and incredibly successful business tactic designed to create monopolies and crush smaller, unbranded competitors. The truth, as usual, is likely a complex mix of both. The Quaker calculators probably did believe in the moral value of their pure product, but they were also astute businessmen who understood the immense commercial power of a trusted brand. You look at the tins and boxes lining the shelves. They represent a new kind of order. It is not the oppressive, top-down order of the workhouse diet. It is a commercial order, imposed by manufacturers through packaging and advertising. For the consumer, it is a welcome change. Finally, there is a way to make an informed choice. You can choose the brand you trust. You are no longer just a passive victim of a fraudulent system. You are becoming a consumer, a person with preferences and loyalties. This new world of branded goods offers a glimpse of the future. It is a world of consistency, safety, and choice, but also a world of mass production, advertising, and corporate power. The fight against adulteration has inadvertently paved the way for the rise of the giant food corporations that will dominate the 20th century. The simple act of putting your name on a box has set in motion a revolution that will change the face of food forever. And it all started with the simple desire for a biscuit that was not stale, and a cup of cocoa that was actually cocoa. The rise of branded goods marks a turning point, a shift from anonymous fear to commercial trust. To truly understand the impact of this revolution, you need to hold it in your hand. You decide to make one final purchase, not a risky street pie or a suspicious block of cheese, but one of the new, modern marvels of the age. You buy a small, factory-sealed packet of biscuits. It is from one of the well-known makers, perhaps Victorian & Co., known as the Biscuit Town pioneers from Bermondsey. The packet itself is a small work of art. It is not just a plain paper bag. It is made of waxed paper, neatly folded and sealed with a printed label. The company's name is clearly displayed in an elegant font, alongside a picture of the biscuit and a declaration of its purity. It feels clean, white, and professional. This is not just food. It is a product. You find a bench, this time a cleaner one in one of London's newly established public parks. You open the packet. The seal breaks with a crisp, satisfying tear. Inside, nestled in a row, are several identical, perfectly formed biscuits. They are uniform in shape, color, and size. You take one out. It is a simple, unassuming thing, a Marie biscuit, perhaps, or a rich tea. You take a bite. The flavor is clean and simple. It tastes of flour, a little sugar, a hint of butter. There are no strange chemical aftertastes, no gritty textures. It is exactly what it promises to be, a plain, wholesome biscuit. It is not exciting. It is not a gourmet delight. But after everything you have eaten on this journey, its simple honesty is the most delicious thing you have ever tasted. It is the taste of safety. This is the mainstream historical significance of the factory-produced, packaged biscuit. It represented the triumph of industrial production over chaotic, craft-based fraud. Companies like Victorian or Huntley and Palmer's built vast, mechanized factories, some of the most advanced of their time. In these factories, the production process was controlled from start to finish. They used high-quality ingredients. Their machinery ensured a consistent product. And the final stage was the all-important sealing of the package. The biscuit in your hand is a symbol of this new industrial order. It is reliable. It is predictable. and it is safe. Now for the specific and rather charming little detail. These biscuit companies were at the forefront of marketing and global logistics. Huntley and Palmer's, for example, became famous for their decorative tins, which were highly sought after. But they also pioneered the use of their brand as a tool of empire. They created specially designed, robust tins that could withstand long sea voyages and tropical climates. British colonial officials, soldiers, and explorers could receive a tin of Huntley and Palmer's biscuits in the middle of Africa or India and get a literal taste of home. The biscuit became a small, edible piece of British identity, a symbol of industrial reliability exported around the globe. The sun, it was said, never set on the British Empire, and it also never set on a tin of Huntley and Palmer's biscuits. The historical debate that emerges from this concerns the social consequences of this industrial food revolution. Did the rise of safe, affordable, mass-produced foods like the factory biscuit lead to a genuine improvement in public health and quality of life? The traditional narrative says yes. Absolutely. It argues that companies like these were industrial heroes who, through efficiency and innovation, helped to end the era of adulteration and provided the working classes with access to better, safer food than ever before. This new industrial diet, based on packaged and processed foods, was a major factor in the rising living standards and life expectancies of the late Victorian period. However, a more critical perspective, often informed by modern nutritional science, offers a more complicated picture. This view argues that while the new industrial food system solved the problem of acute poisoning and contamination, it created a new, long-term problem. The rise of processed foods, the factory biscuit, while safe from almond plaster, is still a product of refined white flour and sugar. This school of thought suggests that this shift marked the beginning of the modern Western diet, a diet that, while safe from immediate harm, would eventually contribute to a host of chronic, lifestyle-related diseases. They ask, did we simply trade the short-term dangers of adulteration for the long-term dangers of processed carbohydrates and sugar? In this interpretation, the sealed packet of biscuits is not just a symbol of safety. It is also a Trojan horse for a new kind of malnutrition. You take another bite of your biscuit. It is a simple pleasure, but your mind is wrestling with its complex legacy. This biscuit represents the end of the horrors you have witnessed. No more chalky bread, no more lead-painted cheese, no more recycled tea. It is a victory for science, for regulation, and for consumer trust, but it is also the beginning of another story. The story of mass-produced food, global brands, and a diet increasingly removed from its natural origins. For now, though, sitting on this park bench, the simple, honest taste of the biscuit feels like a miracle. It is a sign that the world you first stepped into, the chaotic, dangerous, and deceptive marketplace, is beginning to fade. The dark age of adulteration is giving way to a new, more predictable era. The city, and the food within it, is being cleaned up, one sealed packet at a time. Finishing your last biscuit, you get up from the park bench and walk back into the city streets. The London you see now, and the closing years of your journey, feels subtly but perceptibly different from the one that first assaulted your senses. It is the same city, but the lens has been refocused. The change is not in the grand buildings or the layout of the streets, but in the small details of daily life, particularly in the way food is presented and sold. The mainstream historical truth is that by the last quarter of the 19th century, the combined forces of regulation, scientific advancement, and the rise of branding had made a real dent in the practice of food adulteration. The most egregious and dangerous forms of contamination, the ones you experienced firsthand, were in retreat. You walk past a baker's shop. The loaves in the window are still white, but it is a more natural, creamy white. The baker knows a public analyst could test his bread at any moment, and the risk of being fined and publicly shamed for using alum is no longer worth the small profit. You pass a grocer, and the jars of pickles on the shelf are a dull, natural olive green. The terrifying, vibrant green of the copper sulfate has vanished from respectable shops. Deemed too risky and too old-fashioned, the cheese on the counter is a pale, honest yellow, its color no longer a lie. The street markets, while still chaotic, feel a bit more orderly. The presence of inspectors, though still not as common as they should be, has made vendors more cautious with their scales and their sales patter. The most blatant deceptions are fading away. You can still get a bad deal, that you are far less likely to get a lethal one. The age of impunity is over. This leads to a specific, interesting little observation about a change in the city's smellscape. While the coal smoke is still pervasive, one of the most infamous odors is gone. Thanks to the monumental efforts of the engineer, Joseph Baselettage, and his new sewer system, completed in the 1872s. The city's waste is no longer being dumped directly into the Thames in central London. The Great Stink is now a memory. The river is still far from clean, but it no longer ferments and bubbles with raw sewage on hot summer days. This has a direct impact on the food supply. The water drawn from the river and pumps is gradually becoming safer, reducing the invisible layer of contamination that plagued so much of what you first encountered. The historical debate around this period concerns the civilizing process. Did these changes, safer food, cleaner water, more honest labeling, genuinely make people more civilized? Or did they just create new forms of social control? The optimistic view, popular among Whiggish historians, sees this as a clear story of progress. Science, reason, and good governance triumphed over ignorance and fraud. Life became safer, healthier, and better for everyone. The cleanup of the food supply is presented as a key chapter in the great Victorian story of urban improvement, alongside the building of parks, libraries, and museums. A more skeptical, Falcalduna perspective would see it differently. This school of thought would argue that the new systems of regulation and branding were not just about safety. They were about creating a more docile, predictable, and manageable population. The state, through its analysts and inspectors, and the corporations, through their standardized products, were extending their control into the most intimate aspect of life, the daily meal. The chaos of the old market was replaced by the rigid order of the factory and the laboratory. In this view, the civilizing process is also a disciplining process. People were safer, yes, but they were also more tightly integrated into a system of state and corporate power. The freedom to be cheated was replaced by the obligation to be a responsible, brand-loyal consumer. You do not feel particularly disciplined. You just feel relieved. The constant, low-level anxiety that has been your companion throughout this journey is finally beginning to dissipate. The queasiness in your stomach has subsided. You can look at a piece of food in a shop window without your mind immediately cataloging the possible poisons it contains. The world around you is by no means perfect. Poverty is still rampant. The living conditions for the poor are still appalling. The workhouse still casts its long, green shadow, but one of the most insidious and invisible threats has been brought into the light and is being fought. The daily meal is no longer a game of Russian roulette. The toxic fog of adulteration that hung over the city as food supply is starting to lift. It has not disappeared completely, and new challenges are emerging. But the era of blatant, life-threatening, and universal fraud is drawing to a close. You have walked through the darkest days of the Victorian kitchen and have emerged into the grey dawn of a safer, more regulated world. The journey has been unpleasant, but the destination offers a quiet sense of hope. You find a quiet place to sit, perhaps on the same park bench where you ate your miraculous, ordinary biscuit. The frantic, desperate energy of your journey has subsided, replaced by a sense of calm contemplation. The sun, a rare sight in this city, might even be breaking through the haze, casting long shadows across the grass. Now is the time to look back, to take stock of the dark menu you have sampled on your trip through time. You close your eyes and the sensory ghosts of your journey return, not as immediate threats, but as memories. You recall the weight of that first loaf of bread, so promising in its whiteness, and the gritty, mineral taste of the almond chalk within it. You can almost feel the thin, watery texture of the doctored milk, and the faint, unsettling sweetness of the chalk used to whiten it. The memory of the penny pie comes back, the flaky crust giving way to the overly peppery, mysterious filling that could have been anything. A gamble in every bite. Then comes the phantom taste of the sweets. You remember the brilliant, toxic green of the arsenic-laced candy, a beautiful jewel of poison. You recall the bitter, dusty disappointment of the recycled tea, a pale imitation brought back to life with graphite. The soft, bready texture of the sausage, its cheapness masked by a blast of spice, a potential mix of stale bread and horse meat. You think of the pub, the watery, thin beer given a false kick by toxic berries, in the harsh, turpentine-laced gin that offered a brutal, chemical escape. The memories of the preserved foods surface next. The shocking, metallic crunch of the copper-dyed pickle, its vibrant green a beautiful lie. The waxy, bland cheese, its healthy, rustic color painted on with red lead. Each memory is a testament to a system of ingenious, desperate, and dangerous deception. This recollection of your meals serves as a powerful summary of the mainstream historical knowledge of the era. This was not just a few isolated incidents of fraud. It was a systemic, deeply ingrained feature of the urban food supply. From the most basic staples like bread and milk to the small treats like sweets and beer, almost nothing was what it seemed. The driving forces were clear: rapid urbanization, a lack of regulation, scientific ignorance on the part of both consumer and many producers, and the relentless pressure of poverty, which forced people to seek the cheapest possible calories, no matter the risk. As you sit there, a strange, lesser-known fact might pop into your head. Amidst all this fraud, there were pure food movements and even early health food advocates. Some people were aware of the dangers and actively sought out alternatives. Vegetarians, for example, argued that a meat-free diet was not only morally superior but also safer, as it allowed one to avoid the horrors of the sausage and pie trade. There were small shops and cooperatives that prided themselves on sourcing pure and unadulterated goods. These were niche movements, accessible only to the middle classes who had the time and money to seek them out. But they show that even in the darkest times, there was a countercurrent, a search for an honest meal. The historical debate that this reflection brings to mind is a profound one. How resilient is the human body and spirit? Looking back at the menu of poisons and frauds you have survived, it seems almost impossible that a city could function, let alone grow and thrive, under such conditions. Some historians, focusing on mortality rates and disease. Paint a picture of a population constantly on the brink of collapse, weakened and sickened by their environment. Other historians, however, emphasize the incredible toughness and resilience of the Victorian Londoner. They argue that the human body adapted. People developed immunities. They had a kind of street-level wisdom about what to eat and what to avoid. They survived not because the system was benign, but because they were incredibly tough. Their spirit, too, was resilient. Despite the misery, they found joy in the small things. The song in a pub, a day out in the park, the taste of a hot pie on a cold day, even if they chose not to think too hard about its contents. This view does not downplay the suffering, but it celebrates the remarkable human capacity to endure, to adapt, and to find life even in the most hostile of environments. You open your eyes. The city seems quieter now. Your journey has been a tour of a nutritional nightmare, a first-hand experience of a society poisoning itself from the inside out. But you survived, and so did London. The people you saw, with their pale faces and thin frames, were not just victims. They were survivors. They navigated a world where the staff of life could be a stone, and they lived to tell the tale, to build a future, and to eventually demand something better. The dark menu you have reviewed is not just a story of deception. It is a story of survival. Your time on the park bench comes to an end. It is time to take one last walk, to see how the legacy of this dark culinary history has shaped the world that is emerging. You rise and head back into the heart of the city. But you are not looking for food anymore. You are looking for the echoes of the past and the foundations of the future. You walk into a modern grocery store, a Sainsbury's, perhaps, which began as a single dairy shop in 1816 and built its empire on the promise of quality and hygiene. The change is breathtaking. The store is bright, clean, and orderly. Everything is packaged, labeled, and branded. You pick up a loaf of bread. On the packaging, there is a list of ingredients. A list. This simple, legally mandated feature is a direct legacy of the fight against the almond chalk you first encountered. It is the ghost of Dr. Hassel's microscope, made manifest in ink on paper. You walk down an aisle and see a mother giving her child a brightly colored juice drink. You look at the label, and it lists the coloring agents used. Sunset yellow, Allura red, all approved, tested, and regulated substances. The vibrant, toxic colors of the leadened copper sweets have been replaced by a system of codes and safety standards. It is the legacy of the Bradford sweet tragedy, a hard-won victory for public health. You see pre-packaged, vacuum-sealed sausages and pies. The label details the exact percentage of meat, the type of meat, and a nutritional information panel. The bag of mystery has been forced to reveal its secrets. This transparency is the direct result of a century of consumer suspicion and the eventual triumph of regulation over the butchers who once used stale bread and horse meat. This is the great, overarching historical truth of your journey's end. The modern supermarket, with its mind-boggling variety and its emphasis on hygiene and information, did not appear out of thin air. It was forged in the fires of the 19th century food crisis. Every food label, every sell-by date, every government health inspector, every standard of public hygiene is a direct descendant of the struggle you have witnessed. Our contemporary food system is built upon the foundations of this terrible history. We live in the world that Arthur Hill Hassel, Thomas Weckley, and the other reformers fought to create. Now for one final, specific detail that ties the past to the present. You might see a bottle of London Pride beer or a craft gin labeled distilled in London. Today, London's brewing and distilling scenes are celebrated for their quality and craftsmanship. This is a beautiful irony. The city that was once infamous for its watered-down, toxic beer and its turpentine-laced mother's ruin has reclaimed its reputation. The modern craft movement is, in a way, a redemption story. A conscious effort to restore the quality and honesty that was lost during the desperate years of the Industrial Revolution. And so we come to the final historical debate of our journey. What is the ultimate legacy of this period? Have we truly solved the problems? Or have they just changed form? One perspective is the narrative of progress. It holds that the story is one of unequivocal victory. We defeated adulteration. We have created the safest, most abundant, and most transparent food supply in human history. The problems of the Victorian era are relics of a bygone age, and we should be grateful for the scientific and regulatory systems that protect us. The other, more critical perspective argues that the fundamental conflict remains. The desire of producers to maximize profit at the expense of quality has not disappeared. It has just become more sophisticated. Instead of almond red lead, the debate is now about hidden sugars, ultra-processed ingredients, misleading health claims, and the environmental impact of industrial agriculture. The battle between the consumer's right to know and the producer's desire to sell is still being fought every day. In the halls of government, in advertising agencies, and in the aisles of the supermarket. In this view, the legacy of the Victorian food crisis is a lesson we must constantly relearn. That vigilance is the permanent price of safe and honest food. You stand there, in the bright, clean, modern store. It feels a million miles away from the grimy, dangerous streets where your journey began. The transformation is immense. The war against the old poisons has, in large part, been won. You are safe from the specific horrors of the 19th century menu, but the underlying tensions, the questions of trust, transparency, and the true meaning of quality, still linger. They are the ghosts that remain, the enduring legacy left on every plate and in every shopping basket. Your journey is over, but the story of our relationship with the food we eat, a story so powerfully shaped by this dark chapter, continues. And so, your journey through the grim and greasy kitchens of Victorian London comes to a close. The sharp, acrid smells of coal smoke and river mud begin to fade, replaced by the quiet, familiar set of your own room. The unsettling memory of chalky bread and metallic pickle softens, dissolving like sugar in tea. You can feel the solid ground of the present beneath you. A world where a glass of milk is just a glass of milk, and a loaf of bread is, for the most part, just a loaf of bread. The ghosts of the market vendors, the bakers, and the publicans recede into the mist of history, their desperate cries and deceptions muffled by the passage of time. The queasy feeling in your stomach has long since vanished, leaving only a deep, peaceful stillness. You are floating now, drifting on a gentle current, far away from the clatter of iron wheels and the roar of the factory. You are safe. The struggles of that forgotten era have been fought, and the peace of a quiet night is your reward. Let the rhythm of your own breathing be the only sound. The soft, steady hum carrying you deeper into rest. The story is over, and all that is left is the gentle, welcoming silence of sleep.